Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. It's great to see all of you. I hope you all had some time to rest and get a little time for yourselves. Just by way of background and for our friends who may be new to this task force, I'm Stephanie Villaforte, and I serve as Colorado's Child Protection Ombudsman, and I serve as the chair of this particular task force. So, just to go ahead and kick things off, all of you should have received your agenda, both in the Zoom link as well as to your Dropbox link. Before I go on, did anybody have difficulty accessing the materials? Okay. Oh, Anna, go ahead. You're good?
I'm saying that I can't access the materials.
You cannot. Okay. All right, let us email those out to you or get you another link. I'll let Jen work on that right now. Anybody else?
If you could send those to me as well, Stephanie, wasn't able to access them.
Okay, all right. And I'm checking my second page. Anybody else? All right, so what you have in the link would be to the Dropbox, where today you have not only the agenda, but there are 2 research articles that discuss the really the notion of runaways, studies that really talk about the whys and the hows and all of that information. So that should all be in your Dropbox this morning. If in the future, you need, for example, emails sent to you, please let Jennifer know that. I know sometimes people have access to different online or on cloud services and all of that. So for some reason, this doesn't work for you, just let us know and we can certainly send them a second way for you. But great. So in the link, we have our agenda. And so just to kick off, last time we were together, we talked about requesting volunteers for a co-chair. And I just wanted to announce that Beth McNally has agreed to serve as my co-chair. I'm thrilled to have you, Beth. And Beth, if you would just come off a little mute and just reintroduce yourself and wave your hand so everyone knows again who you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth McNally. I'm the program manager with Denver Public Safety Youth Programs. I oversee the Ronnie Project, which is Runaway Outreach, Notification, and Intervention. And I'm also the coordinator for the Juvenile Denver Anti-Trafficking Alliance multidisciplinary team.
So, and Beth, thank you for your service. We are going to try to minimize the workload on you, but Beth will be working with us, helping us review agendas, meeting materials, and probably most significantly, making sure I stick to the script, that we do all the things that need to get done in a particular meeting, and in my absence, she will be here to help. So thanks again, Beth, I appreciate it. The next item I just wanted to talk to all of you about briefly is in the next day or so, you'll be receiving an email from me. I love that we can meet virtually. We can, be comfortable, we can be safe, we can, stay warm, all those great things. But what I really do miss is the ability to get to know each of you, the way we used to when we had physical meetings, right? It's the cup of coffee we share before a meeting. It's the break time to walk down a hall and discuss what we just learned. It's the after meeting where we get to catch up and maybe even set up a lunch or a coffee. And because we aren't able to do that, I am going to be reaching out to each of you with an email so that we can schedule just one-on-one time and get to know each other better. While I have everybody's bios and resumes, and I know your credentials, you're far more than the piece of paper, right, that list all of those things. And I just want to make sure that I get to know you. You can share with me if we're giving you all that you need in order to, navigate the task force. And I also just want to know what are the things and talents and skills you have that really we can share with the broader group that may not have made it on your resume or your application. So if you would pay attention to that email when it comes, it's pretty self-explanatory. We'd just like to meet with all of you for about 30 minutes, and there's a scheduling link in there as well. So it's all pretty automated. Jennifer automates things. You would be doing it old school with me, and we trade 18 phone calls. So she's far better at all this, and it should be pretty easy for you to do. So please pay attention to that. I'd love to talk to all of you again. And I think the only other thing I just wanted to say is, again, thank you for your service here. It's been really rewarding already to see the amount of community involvement and attention that's been paid to this issue. Since we started only a couple months ago, we've received over 12 original press mentions in our local press, whether that's 9 News, the Denver Post, the Colorado Sun. We've also been picked up on the wire by a number of rural publications as well. And so I tell you that by way of saying, what we're doing here is really important, and the community is really engaged in this conversation. So again, I appreciate your being involved, and I'm glad people are paying attention, because this really will help us down the road as we decide, what directions we want to go, what recommendations we want to make. It will just help to know that our community is behind us, and they're listening and they're learning. So I just wanted to mention that. And with that, I will quit talking and turn it over to Jennifer, our Director of Public Policy, to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie. It's funny because I haven't yet been introduced to this group. I joined I know I've been introduced to a lot of groups, so that's why, but I joined the Child Protection Ombuds office in mid-November. I've caught up on your meetings so far, so I feel like I recognize all of you, but just wanted to say hello. So as a way of framing our work, the first 2 meetings really laid the groundwork for why we're here, and how each of you brings an important and a unique viewpoint to the table. So as we start the new year, we wanted to take just a few minutes to, again, provide you a framework that will guide our work together over the next 2 years. So there's 2 things I want you to keep in mind. The first is that, again, we have this multitude of experiences and expertise and knowledge at the table. So part of this process is the process of alignment. So we have people who work in the system, they work in different parts of the system. So it's about seeing, what are the differences there? Do you share terminology? What do your processes look like in each piece of the system? We also have people with lived experience. So part of the magic of a group like this is how we bring all these viewpoints and experiences together to understand the system and the issues that we're charged with. The second thing to keep in mind is that while the legislation that created this task force specifically outlines some of the issues that the task force should address, this process is responsive. It's responsive to your questions and your insights. So this process will evolve, and we obviously, I hope we continue to reiterate that we encourage you to interrogate the information. So constantly be asking, what else do we need to know? And that will help guide our work going forward. So a couple of things I wanted to share with you. Again, they are in the Dropbox. Let's see here. This is what the Dropbox looks like, but we have the legislative charge. So this is a portion of the legislation that created this task force. And it specifically lays out what the task force's work. I won't read these to you, but I wanted to provide them as a reference. So it can help guide the information that you're gathering in these meetings. And the second I wanted to lay out was the syllabus that we've created. And again, this is a document that will evolve as our meetings go on. But I wanted to show you, A, we have a plan, and B, how we're thinking about this. So, the syllabus is a general outline of the topics that we have planned for our meetings going forward. I wanted to point out that these the legislative charges are outlined in gray, just to make sure that we're covering, what we need to cover. But what we've tried to do is create this intuitive order that logically flows from the task force discussions. So if you see anything missing, certainly let us know. But again, just keep in mind that this will evolve as we go along. So for example, today, we're going to take a look at the current state and how the system works now, this objective look at operations and processes across the system. We're going to hear from our speakers about some national trends in the data and some predictors of children who go missing from care. At our next meeting, we'll start to dive into the data and the law at both the national and the state level, and we'll start to bring in additional perspectives. And then in May, we'll hear from Dr. Kristen Myers from UNC, and these are the focus groups that she's running. So she will provide that data, and then we'll take some time to do a data reflection. So that'll bring together all of the data information that you've been presented with. And then in July, we'll start to look at best practices. So again, our phase 1 report, and that's sort of outlined in the legislation as well, is due in October. So we'll use this September meeting to review the report with the task force and make sure we're all on the same page. And then again, we'll bring in some best practices, and then this critical piece of the legislative charge is co-designing a coordinated response. So bringing together all of this information that we've gathered and presented, and really starting to work in as far as what would a better system look like. So yeah, are there any questions as we look at this? And again, this is all in the Dropbox. I have emailed you copies, but I will email them again to you as well. All right. Well, so the first half of our meeting, we have asked task force members to give us an overview of how the system works. So this is how the different pieces of the system fit together when a child goes missing from out-of-home placement. We're specifically looking at those pieces of the system, the county departments, the state department, facilities, and law enforcement. But of course, all of you bring, you fill certain roles in the system as well. So while we're looking specifically at those big buckets, we do want you to sort of chime in at those pieces of the continuum where you each play a role. So our goal is to really come up with a picture, again, how these different pieces fit together. In our previous meetings, we've identified issues with the system, gaps, but today is really about taking this objective look at what the operations and the processes look like. So with that, I will turn it over to Barrick and Trace to lead us through this discussion.
Thanks,
Trace,
Jen.
it's all you.
All right, thanks, Barrick. Thanks, Jen, appreciate that. So we've got these key questions that Jen sent out to the group, and we've kind of identified who we think the obvious players are in answering these from, again, those three buckets around, CDHS, law enforcement, facility, and then county DHS as well. But we also want everyone to participate, jumping in, asking questions. Also, you might have a role that we aren't aware of in the system of this as well. So we want folks this is really a conversation amongst task force members. So I'm going to drop in the key questions here, and then I'm going to just kind of guide us through, starting with one of those buckets of folks. I know that Sergeant Cotter is not going to be on until 8:30, so we'll come to law enforcement group a little later. But these are the key questions. So, and I want to name a piece real quick. So when we look at the charge of this task force, right, around reducing runaways, obviously this is talking about the system of what happens when a child does run away, right? So we want to make sure we recognize that there's that tension of like, well, but we're talking about how to reduce. We want to make sure we have a current state analysis of what happens when a child does, because we also know that the repetitive behaviors of a child is a very real thing as well. And so we want to understand also any gaps that might exist in the system. So that's why we're asking these particular questions. But we're going to be, again, like Jen said, we're going to be coming back and asking a lot more questions on all sides of this issue. But we wanted to make sure that when we talk around what the challenges are, what the gaps might be, and what the actual system is, that we're all using the same language and we're all on the same page there. So I'm going to start with the first question, and I'm looking, so just as a heads up, County DHS, I've got Lynette and Michelle, they're both here, right? Yep, Lynette and Michelle. So we kind of have you flagged, and so I'm gonna start with y'all on it. Thinking again with your hat in your system, when we think about procedures, protocols that you employ when a child runs away and goes missing, what data gets reported to whom and when, and what really happens. So when you're coming off, if you could just again introduce yourself briefly and let us know kind of where you are and what you're representing, but would love for you to really hone in on this first question. Lynette, I'm seeing you kind of on my screen, so I'm gonna come to you first, but would love to hear your thoughts on this first question.
Yeah, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that this is pretty standard across the entire state. It's part of the Volume 7 rules and our criteria. And by the way, I'm from Mesa County on the western slope. When a child runs away, the placement is to notify law enforcement first, so that they're notified immediately when there's a child or youth that is absconded from placement. Then they notify the Child Protection Hotline. That entity gets a hold of the county if it's the HCC, which is the state hotline. Every county has their own as well, and their own contacts for them to be contacted. That person then makes sure that it's reported on the National Missing and Exploited Children website with all the details and information, and that the caseworker is notified and parents are notified and guardian ad litem is notified. And then the next day, the court is also notified.
Thanks for that. Michelle, anything to add there as far as just the logistics go? I'm not sure if I'm seeing Michelle. Okay. Anybody else from your perspective around, or a question, or also anything to add for context? Again, we're just honing on this first question.
Right. I think the only other thing to add is answering questions 2 or 3 is what happens while a child is missing is not only is law enforcement hopefully looking for those children. Some jurisdictions, law enforcement is so busy that it's just if they happen to run across them while they're out on their patrols or doing other things. Some jurisdictions are really good about following up with last place they were picked up, if they have left placement before or had a history of running away prior to placement, which is often the case with adolescents. We reach out to friends, family friends, things like that. Caseworkers will go, and I can remember one time I went to a boy's house and got my 14-year-old youth that was on the run back out of that home and took her back to placement. So caseworkers do proactively go looking for their youth when they have an idea of where they might be. We often try to text them or call them, especially if they're adolescents and they have a phone, to try to talk them into coming back in or meeting with the caseworker. So there's lots of efforts that are done while a child is on the run to try to get them to a safe place, get them back into care along the way. And once they return from placement, we really try to process with them what was going on, what they could have done differently. If they're in a residential treatment program, like a QRTP or something, the therapists often meet with these youth right away to kind of debrief what happened, how they made that decision, what they're going to do different next time so that they're not continuing to run.
Thanks, Lynette. Stephanie, I'm seeing you with your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. I have a question for you. What is in your experience, the time frame in which that initial report that a child is missing is made? And because I've heard a lot of different things. Some say, well, the kid runs, so sometimes we give it 24 hours, sometimes we wait 48, sometimes we call the minute they leave the door. That's my first question, and then I have a second follow-up.
So if it's a residential treatment program, or a licensed treatment program that they're absconding from or running from, they notify right away because they're supposed to be a line of sight facility or at least have eyes on every 15 minutes. So a youth may be out of their sight for a few minutes before they realize that they've left and aren't coming back. Like might even assume they're in the bathroom, but it's never more than 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
If they're running from a foster home or even a group home, because they're allowed to leave the placements, and act like normal kids in the community, sometimes it's not realized that they're missing until an hour or 2 hours later when they should have been checking in and should have been back.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Lynette. And my other question to you is, I'm familiar with volume 7, and like you said, really debriefing with the youth when they return, right? To learn about their experiences, what could be done differently. Is that information necessarily stored in the Trails database, where, I guess what I'm trying to get to is where if there were subsequent placements for a youth, like we could have a record knowing, like whomever, if there's a new caseworker, for example, they would know a child's prior history in that regard?
Sorry, I clicked the mute button by accident. There is a record in the contact notes, but a new caseworker being assigned to the case would have to go back and read those, or read the 90-day reviews, which talk about why a child, what happened to them during that 90-day review period. And runaway episodes should be always listed on those. I think the trouble is that if caseworker turnover is too high, that information does get lost.
Yeah,
On
thank
the pages, it'll say why they had to move, why this placement is better. And sometimes it is because the last placement refused to continue to serve them because they kept running away.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. Anna, I'm seeing your hand up, and then Brandon, I'm going to bring you in because I have a question for you, just as a heads up. Go ahead, Anna.
I was just going to say, my understanding of volume is we also have to complete the high risk victimization tool upon every run return if a child is in the department's custody. So there will be a record of the discussion in regards to experiences while on the run within that victimization tool within Trails.
You're right. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks, Anna. Brandon, I want to come to you next because something Lynette said around, residential. We talk often about stretch systems and capacity and just what the reality is versus what policies are. And so from your perspective, is that you have a kid who's either completely unexpected or this is not their first runaway rodeo, right? Like we're talking all different scenarios. Realistically, what does that look like for you all from a staffing perspective, and also from a relationship perspective of how you're treating that kid in that moment? What are you required to do, and what do you do? I'm not trying to put you on the spot of like what you do in practice, but is there a tension there, between the two, and how does that actually play out in reality?
As far as like our procedures around runaways?
Yeah, procedures of when a kid runs away and who you report it to and et cetera.
Yeah, so our procedures are pretty standard. If a kid walks off the facility or runs away, we contact their team, referral team, their family upon immediately when they leave our campus grounds. And we contact the police as well. And we try to stay in contact, visual contact until we lose sight, and then and we try to verbally de-escalate them and until as far as we can. We have a lot of terrain around us, so it's hard at times to do that. We can't go into private property. If they do present a safety issue in that process, it can change the dynamics of it, and other things, interventions may happen at the time, but we try to monitor it as close as we can. And then if we lose sight of them, we, like I said, we've notified the PD, and they'll monitor it at that point. And then go back to the facility, and we wait until we hear from the PD at that point. If they, most of the time, because there's not many places to go in our area, so they're caught pretty quickly, and so PD will return them, and sorry. Sorry about that. The PD will return pretty quickly, and then they'll return pretty quickly, and then we'll bring back the facility and we reintegrate them into the facility. We process them back into the milieu and screen them back in and try to figure out what happened at that point, and go from there and see what plan they need at that point.
So Brandon, a quick question. You said that, once you lose sight, that you all kind of go back to the facility, right? And then it's really on PD, it sounds like, to when they might find this kid. Gotcha. Okay. So beyond the sight piece, then you all are kind of like, okay, we've got to go back and continue running this place and caring for these kids, and then he's able to track them down.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Brandon. Beth, coming to you.
Yeah, I wanted to just circle back to the HRV tool for DHS. Just a couple of questions. I'm curious as to what the training caseworkers receive on how to implement the HRV tool. And then are there anything in place to check that has, in fact, on every youth that's run and then returned, that the HRV tool has been completed? And then if there are concerns from that HRV tool, what's your next process? Who does that go to?
Thanks, Beth. Lynette, I was going to bring it over to you.
Yeah, there's a couple of problems with the high-risk victimization tool, to be perfectly frank and honest. Part of it is a Trails issue. Trails mod was supposed to roll out in 2017. It still hasn't. Half of Trails is now rolled out into the new Trails modernization project. The other half is still in Trails legacy. So to even find the high-risk victimization tool, you have to go into Trails mod and do a client search and then look for those separately. You cannot access it from Trails legacy, where ongoing workers and intake workers are still working out of. So it requires a whole second step. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is there's no directions on what to do with the tool if they are high risk, other than talking to the youth, understanding that they're at high risk for victimization. I think caseworkers are really good about that. I think the problem is that brand new caseworkers don't get a lot of training in that tool right off the bat. And when it first rolled out, there was training, but I don't see ongoing training with that tool when I look at the child welfare training system. So that's the problems with the tool, is it doesn't go to step two.
There's an initial kind of ground lane for the tool, but then it doesn't continue on. Anna.
I think my experience is that might be dependent on county and county practice. Denver has different internal trainings. The state does not have an ongoing training by any means in regards to it. And then there's different next steps within the Denver metro system, should there be, for the HRV tool in general, and it goes to another group of a multidisciplinary team that reviews it and monitors and develops next steps based on risk. And that multidisciplinary team is connected with the courts, probation, the police department, a number of different entities within the community. So I think it's not statewide, the next steps with the HRV tool.
Thanks, Anna. And I'm seeing Michelle joining. And so I'm wondering, Michelle, I'm going to kind of throw you in. Beth, do you want to kind of repeat that question for Michelle? Because we've got another kind of county perspective here. I'd just be curious to hear her answer as well.
Yeah, so it was regarding the HRV tool, wanting to know what the training is that you guys have received regards to filling out the HRV tool, and then what are the steps in checking whether or not that tool has in fact been completed. And then if there are concerns, what's the next process? Because to touch on Anna, yeah, I end up getting for Denver, I get those HRV tools that are high risk, but there's only 7 multidisciplinary teams for human trafficking in the state of Colorado. So, what's happening within those other counties when they do have that high risk youth? So yeah, those are my questions.
Yeah. So Probably like twice a year, we'll provide a training to our department, all the caseworkers, on how to complete the tool, that it's really not a questionnaire that you complete with the youth. It's more like information gathering from, parents and the schools and the youth and all the people that you talk to during an assessment. And then once that tool is completed, they send it to me, and then I send it to, I'm on the task force for the 18th judicial HRV. So then I'll send it to Robert, who kind of heads all that up. And then we review them at our monthly meeting. And in that process, we are talking about, any sort of services that are involved, what the family might need. We determine, is it really high risk trafficking, or is it more like gang related, or is the youth in a domestic violence relationship? And then we might screen it out, or we might set it out a couple months to re-review to get some more information. So that's kind of that process of like where the tool comes from. I will say that if we have custody of a kiddo, we are required to complete it in trails if the whereabouts are unknown, and that may not result in submitting the tool to the task force. We might determine that no, there's like no trafficking, the kid just went to the boyfriend's house and we didn't know where they were. Yeah, so I'm sorry, there was like 3 other questions.
I think that you answered all of them except for like, are there anything in your process to check to confirm that the tool has been completed by the caseworker?
That's a supervisor responsibility. I will say in supervision, when I'm meeting with my caseworkers, we're discussing a kid being on the run. I will make sure that a tool is completed once they do return, and then just follow up that has in fact been completed.
And I guess there's one other thing I want to touch on, that Lynette, like when she's pointing out all the problems with the HRV tool. So especially so when my caseworkers fill it out, it might be on a piece of paper, so they can add a lot of notes.
Yep.
But on trails, my understanding, and same with, when a youth comes in through the jack, when they do it electronically, it forces you to answer yes or no. So when I'm reviewing it, I might get a lot of no answers, when in reality, the screener doesn't know the answer to it.
Right.
So it's being forced to answer no, when in reality, they don't know.
Right,
So,
yeah.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Michelle. Kevin, I'm seeing your hand raised, and then Stephanie, and then Sergeant Cotter, we're going to come to you because I want to make sure that I know you've come prepared to answer some of these questions from a law enforcement perspective, so appreciate you being here. Kevin, go ahead.
Just a question. Lynette had mentioned that one of her steps is to contact the child protection hotline. I was never, obviously I have a son that's run away from facilities numerous times, and I was never aware that was part of the process. I wonder what I guess that's the same as the child abuse and neglect hotline. I wonder what they do with the information, that a child's run. If anyone in the system other than the police is tracking, how many youths do we have in the run, what's going on with each of them, is kind of, pushing the system to actually deal with the kid on the run and not just putting stuff into databases. So I guess those are my 2 questions.
I think what happens when it's called into the hotline is that the caseworker is notified via the hotline, because a lot of kids run after hours. It's just the nature of it. They love Saturdays and Sundays, when the routine at the program is a little bit different. They notify the caseworker. The caseworker makes sure that the rest of the team is aware. So like if there's a family therapist working with the parents or something like that, the whole team is then notified about what's going on. They also will make sure that the parents were notified. If the placement wasn't able to reach them, they'll also reach out. At least that's our practice and policy here in Mesa County. There is a way to pull in a report in trails. It's actually the ARD tickler list. That'll show where a child's placement is showing in trails. So it should change to a runaway status. And then you can track how many kids are on the run at the same time, and you'll know which names of those. Sometimes kids run in groups. That's also another reality. And there's definitely pros and cons to that. The pro is that they're with somebody that they know. The con is you never know what that other person that they know is going to take them to go do. But I like kids to not be alone. That's my personal preference. That information, again, any information on past history of runs, where kids were picked up, things like that, we report that to our local law enforcement or the jurisdiction of the law enforcement of where they ran from, where it got reported to, so that they're aware and can go look in those specific places and locations as well. I think one of the barriers to picking up kids that we haven't talked about is, I love to call them flop houses, but people that will harbor the runaways. And they don't have to let law enforcement in, and law enforcement cannot get in their houses to look for these kids. You may know they're there, but you can't do a darn thing about it. And these are the homes that are giving kids drugs and alcohol and allowing them to have sex and different things like that. That's a huge barrier in the law, is that we cannot really do anything about these people that harbor runaways. I'd be interested to know how many people have been charged in the last 10 years, because I'll bet it doesn't equal 100.
Thanks, Lynette. Stephanie, I'm going to come over to you, and then Sergeant Cotter would love for you to jump in.
Great. Just first of all, Trace, if we could keep a list of the acronyms that are being used and just make sure that we spell those out. I think the first one I've heard today is the HRVT, which I just want to repeat is the high risk victimization tool. Do I have that right, friends? Thank you. Yeah, so if we could just make sure we keep clarifying as we go, and we'll create a list of this and put it in our Dropbox. My question, and this might be a little too deep, and if we need to take this question offline, I'm happy to. It sounds to me that there are jurisdictions, and we've heard from Denver and from Douglas, that have some sort of infrastructure, if you will, right? That a tool is completed, results are given to a multidisciplinary team, who then in turn does things with this information. And I'm just not clear. I assume that is not a statewide instrument, and I'm still not exactly clear what that instrument is and what it does. Like, what do these councils or teams do?
Stephanie, you're reading my mind. I think it's like when we talk around, what does it look like statewide, right? If we're talking at the systems and policy level, I think that's a great question. Jana, I didn't know if that was, you had an answer to that particular question, but if not, okay, so that's a no. So does anybody want to speak to that? I know, Lynette, you're with Mesa County, but anybody else from your experience?
I'd love to hear more from Denver County. We don't have that here in Mesa County. I think a lot of counties are too small. We don't have the full-time employee spaces to be able to run a multidisciplinary team like that. There are a lot of mandates, but not enough people and staff to fill those positions, and not enough money to hire enough people. In a lot of your smaller counties, there's also a lot of communication though between team members and different teams, even in a county our size, where we all know who's on the run. We just have that information because we're a little closer knit. That's the benefit of being smaller. But I'd love to hear from Denver what they're actually doing with that tool, how they're using it, and how it's helping.
I'm not a part of the disciplinary team, so I only have a very periphery knowledge base of it. So I can only really speak in generalities that I understand, which is a monthly meeting, much like, and I apologize, I didn't catch the person's name, but the person from Douglas was speaking on in regards to the court systems, probation, I believe, pretrial and diversion are part of it as well. Our ACAs from Denver Human Services representative. I could connect with our person who attends our multidisciplinary team meeting and like give more of an insight on, ask them to provide more of an insight on it. I know they review each of the tools collectively and discuss the risk factors identified from the tool completed. I know in Denver, much like it was previously talked about, it's a kind of a yes or no checkbox. And so Denver caseworkers are encouraged to provide a supplemental context information in regards to those unknown areas, so that that can be brought into the conversation. But that group just reviews the information I gathered and kind of identifies it in regards to any potential next steps, future awareness with future contact with those youth, in different ways to provide services and to work with them when they, engage with services, whether it be through human services, whether it be through the courts and probation, things of that nature. So don't know if that person from Douglas has a different insight. It sounds like she's on the Douglas County. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but that area task force, so she might have a little bit more context. And I could always ask around in the Denver area and provide more if that's
I guess I want to jump in because I run Denver's human trafficking multidisciplinary team.
Yeah.
And so and I'm also on the Colorado Human Trafficking Council's task force reviewing multidisciplinary teams, because we're trying to create kind of a toolkit to expand multidisciplinary teams throughout the state. And so there's a lot of struggles. We've made a lot of changes, some positive changes. What I can tell you is every multidisciplinary team, so there's 7 in the state, are probably every single one is different in their approach. There's not a standard protocol, and that's part of what that other task force is trying to create, at least a guidebook as to either how to improve your task force or starting a task force within your county. With Denver, and I think, I was participated with Boulder County, so I can speak to, multiple MDTs. The biggest issue that we run into with this is, what are the next steps? And so we've identified a youth that is on the run or is extremely high risk or even has been confirmed trafficked. And then it's like, okay, but they're not disclosing, they're not working with law enforcement. So what's next? And that's what we're creating and building out. So we have kind of a secondary, we have our group meeting, and Anna, you're right, you listed off pretty much everyone who's involved. The problem with that is it's a lot of supervisors that are coming to the meeting as opposed to the actual caseworker who's working with that youth. So we've expanded to where we now have a secondary meeting when we've identified a youth that maybe has a lot of service providers working with a youth, but they're not talking with one another. So that's where we're seeing a lot of gaps in information slipping through the cracks, and then youth not receiving any resources or support services. So that's something that we've implemented, but I can speak to that every MDT is very much so different. And that's something that the council is working on.
Thanks, Beth. Jana, did you have a question? I know you've had your hand up for a little bit, so I just wanted to make sure.
Sorry, I was a little late to that. I'm a parent. I'm new to this task force. So I just had a couple questions that we were talking about. I was wondering if anyone knows, does anything prevent the RTC staff from trying to locate the kids? And I totally understand that they don't have probably the resources and time, but I'm wondering if there's policy, regs, or law that prevents them, because in my experience, and again, I'm just a parent, a lot of times the RTC staff really knows these kids and their connections. And so it seems like, I know that they would probably give a lot of information to the police, but I'm just wondering, to prevent more trauma to the kids, have the RTC staff try to reach them, chat with them, go after them. We had one child who did run from an RTC, and the staff went after them, saw him and another gentleman. Lynette, I love everything you say. Another little guy walking along the highway, and picked him up and brought him back without that police again and everything. The other thing I was wondering about is when you're saying that the police cannot enter the private flop houses. I love that, because that's been our struggle too, is you have these places that harbor our kids. I don't understand, and I would love if we could address this, and maybe now isn't the appropriate time, and sounded like you were going to get an officer to speak. Contributing to a delinquency of a minor, interference with custody. I don't understand. It seems like we have some things in place in law. If your husband who doesn't have primary custody takes your kid too long and doesn't return your kid, there are repercussions. So I don't understand why we can't get our kids back from a custody issue, or like I said, delinquency of a minor. These are just some of my thoughts that I was hoping maybe somebody would address. Thank you so much.
Jen, I appreciate that. And by the way, you're not just a parent. So when you said that, I was like, yeah, that's
overwhelmed by all of you guys.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you naming that. And I'm going to come back to that first question. And I appreciate that question because, again, as we think about the charge of this task force, right, and why we're having this conversation, which really is grounded in what adjustments or gaps need to be addressed, all in service of reducing runaways, right? And so I think you're asking that question around like, we know these relationships are important to these kids, and how, from a systems perspective, are we ensuring that those relationships are through line through any sort of programs or systems, law enforcement, et cetera, that they might encounter, after they do run away. So I appreciate that. And Brandon, I saw your hand kind of fly up. So I'm curious from your perspective. And then I really am, Sergeant Cotter, coming to you, because I think that that's a great transition to kind of from your perspective of how you do see those relationships playing a role in your work. But then also let's talk systems. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, so depending on the situation, we have we work with law enforcement. They have called us if they've seen the kid in a particular area. A lot of our kids, depending on the type of runaway, if we know where the kid's at, our community's a small community, they'll contact us. And we'll go down there. We're kind of on the outskirts of the town, so it takes a minute to get to the main town. So there's a lot in between there. So if somebody witnesses a kid, they'll contact us, and we'll go and talk to the kid. So a lot of times it just depends on the situation. It makes sense. And where the kid's going, what direction, and are we able to get there? Like I said, there's a lot of terrain challenges, so like it just depends on the situation and the scenario. If we're capable, we have to. So it's just situational at that point, but we're always in communication with law enforcement or the community. We try to be, and we definitely we try to be open to doing that if that helps the situation.
Thanks, Brandon. Sergeant Cotter, I want to bring you into the conversation first to address that conversation around how you all see those relationships playing a role in your systems. But then I'm also going to drop these questions back in the chat that were sent to you via email that I know you intend on answering as well. And would love, I've heard law enforcement come up in multiple parts of this conversation, both before you joined, but also after you joined. So hoping that we can also get to some of those questions. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. So I was trying to make notes, and I'm happy to talk about any other questions that people have that I might have missed. But one of the sort of themes in the last couple of comments was about harboring and contributing and interference, and all of those are valid. So harboring, we can and occasionally do charge harboring. Where we usually run into problems when we try to convince prosecutors that a harboring charge should be filed or fully prosecuted is usually the sort of the best interest of the child argument. So was the person who was harboring trying to help the child out in some way? And we have to overcome that. That is often the case when we talk about related people. When we talk about unrelated, like the trap house you guys were talking about, those are fair charges. And the discussion really has to be with the local law enforcement and local prosecutors, because there are statutes that allow for criminal charging on these cases, and that includes the violation of custody, which is a felony level offense. That's an F5. unless they take the child out of state, then it can be an F4. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor can often happen in these trap houses, and that can be an F4. Really, it's the burden of proof. Can we prove that something happened that did contribute to the delinquency, did contribute to a child violating a law? Just being in somebody else's house isn't going to have us charge that person with contributing, but harboring is valid. The violation of custody can, again, in certain instances. So the points that were made there, I just want to validate. Those are things that can happen, and we really have to get local law enforcement in. Something that when I participate in these kinds of meetings in other venues, I try to remind people that in the United States, our law enforcement system is not as centralized as human services is. You guys, as in human services, have a state red trails system. You have statewide oversight. We barely have that. We do have the AG's office, the statewide AG oversees the police officer standards and training, but they do not control the agencies. They're not empowered to make many changes to how agencies operate. Agency policies and the direction of law enforcement and the things they choose to enforce and the way they choose to enforce them are all dictated by their local officials. So mayors, city councils, local police chiefs, elected sheriffs, they drive our policies and our practices. And that makes it tough when we have these big statewide meetings, is because what we do in Denver is not necessarily what's going to happen somewhere else. And I can't assert that really even that it should happen, because every community is different and every community has their own value systems on how they want these things addressed.
Cotter, not to interrupt, sorry, but I do have a question about that. You know, if you were waving your magic wand on what it sounds like you're naming a tension there of, like, you know, you're not as centralized. Is that something that is a frustration from the law enforcement side, or is that just the reality, but it makes sense because of other, you know, processes and just the realities of the work that you do? I just want to make sure that I'm capturing that in a way that, you know, what's the other side of that? Is that hope? Or
that's a great question. It's certainly a big topic, like, because it deals with, from a law enforcement point of view, we're talking about use of force policies, vehicle chase policies. We're talking about, like, staffing. How do we prioritize our resources? These are all decisions that are made at very low level, relatively low level places. The feds don't make the decision. The state doesn't make the decision. Very little state funding actually comes directly to local law enforcement. They're usually funded through more local levels. And so because of that, a lot of the control is at that more local level. So is it a frustration? Yeah, in some ways. Do I see why we have it this way, how it's evolved over time? Yeah, I do see that. So I don't know that when we look at just this topic, we should say we should overhaul the entire criminal justice system and the way it's structured. And do we want a national police force? Because that's sort of the far end, the extreme opposite of what we have now would be a nationalized police force. And do we want that? That's got its own sort of problems and connotations that come with it. So I don't know that I can really say that I don't like how we are. It's not perfect, but I also don't want to say that we should change it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure, not to put you on the spot of like national reform for criminal justice system, but like, you know, just if there was something specific as it relates to your work. So that's helpful to know. I'm seeing a question also, and then let's get back to those questions, but seeing a question from a task force member around, you know, do you find that officers are reluctant to get involved? Like, what's the reality of the challenges that you are seeing on that local level of police force involvement?
So I see, you know, again, going back to the way law enforcement is our officers are very generalized. So our officers are expected to know everything about kind of every crime that can be committed. And the reality is that's not real possible. That's why patrol officers tend to push things to more experienced and dedicated investigators in the larger cities. But in smaller cities, which account for, and I'm not going to quote a statistic because I'm going to get it wrong, but a very large number of law enforcement agencies would count as smaller departments, like less than 100 officers. Very few departments have the large resources that, say, Aurora or Denver police have. Most of them are much smaller. And so when they transfer a specialized investigation case, and I bring that up because we're talking about runaways, which is a nuanced area of responding to children and abuse and neglect and safety of children. Because of that, you'll often get to a detective who's, again, generalized. They'll do a burglary, and they'll do a homicide, and they'll do some sort of internet fraud case, and they won't know all of their tools, and they won't know the best practices all the time. So that's probably the biggest reality in the challenges of law enforcement is we need to make sure that officers understand the goals and what the best practices are, so that when that first level patrol officer responds, they're able to at least start things off in that general direction. I don't know if I answered your question or if I just got to ranting there.
I think that gets at what they were, asking. I think I want to get to these other two questions, and I think you've named that tension of like, you're with we might disagree, but you're with a well-funded department, right? With what a rural, department might see as infinite resources, et cetera, and connections, that sort of thing. So I'm going to name that is going to, sway your answers in some way. And I welcome anybody else to jump in from your perspective, particularly as it relates to rural communities. But, what happens during the period of time the child is missing? From you all, like, I think it was Brandon was saying, like, once they're out of line of sight, then we go back and, PD lets us know when they find them. Like from a agency perspective, like, how does this rank on, how on your priorities of finding these kids and meeting their needs?
Yeah, and let me kind of jump in on that funding. I agree with you. I think in the world of agencies, I am in a very well-funded position. I have a team of 7 detectives that focus on physical and abuse of intrafamilial physical and sexual abuse to kids, and I've got two detectives that are dedicated to missing persons, including runaways. I have 2 more detectives than most agencies in the state. I don't believe that there's any other agency in the state, honestly, that has 2 detectives whose sole job is missing persons, and that's 2. And we handle about 2,500 missing persons a year, and of those 2,500, about 60% of them are runaways. I'm lucky that I have such that amount of resources, but I'm going to point out again, 2. And that's a priority thing on how do we fund our departments, which crimes get more investigative effort, which get fewer. So when I start to answer these next questions, I think I'm closer to best practice, but I'm going to fully admit and own that we could do more, but we have to balance our priorities and we have to balance our funding. And that's coming from a guy who I really do have a lot of support on these. So what are the things that happen from a law enforcement point of view when a child runs away? And I'm gonna start bigger, and then I'll talk more about institutional runaways in a second. So typically on a runaway child, we will dispatch a patrol officer to suss out the case. Again, that's that generalized uniformed officer. 911 calls. He just left the shoplifting at 7-Eleven, or he just left the domestic violence incident that just happened. But they go there and they'll talk with the complainant, so usually the family, a parent, a guardian, about what's the story. And if it sounds like the child has chosen to leave, so not an abduction situation, has chosen to leave, and the child is for Denver, we define that child's age as 12 or older. We say that the child can then make that decision to run away. If they're under 12, so 11 or younger, we don't believe that they're safe out running, that the risk to their safety is just too great to have them that young running away. So at 12 or older, then we will generally generate a report and then a transaction on NCIC, CCIC. So that's that statewide database that tracks warrants and protection orders and criminal histories and missing people. And that the hope there is it's kind of a cast the net theory. So we're going to let everybody that we reasonably can do in a reasonable kind of time frame know that the child's missing, so that if another law enforcement officer finds that child, then they'll know, oh, that's a runaway. We have to handle this a little bit different. It's not just a kid walking down the street. And then often that's the extent of the response. In Denver, I'm lucky that we're able to do a little bit more. We assign each of our cases to a detective, to one of those 2 detectives, and the detectives have a defined time frame to perform at least minimal investigative actions. And what I feel that does is it keeps our finger on the pulse of that missing child. It's not the best. I don't promise that we'll be able to get out in cars and drive around or bang on doors, But if something happens with the child and the community knows about it, my hope is there's a contact point that can help us know it too, and that way we can be responsive to it. And that includes finding out that the kids are staying in a trap house. And, go into one of the comments, can we do anything about getting into a trap house? Yes, Title 19 gives us the authority to get search warrants and go get kids. I have done it. It's not easy. You have to get a search warrant. You don't get to just go in people's houses. Can it be done? Yes. Time, resources. I know in some jurisdictions, getting a judge after hours can be a little bit of a challenge. I don't have that difficulty, so I can, from a privileged point of view, say we're able to do these things. But some agencies don't have that. I have worked with agencies where they couldn't get a judge on the phone for a verbal hold, and from a human services point of view. And so I know that I'm privileged there, but yes, we can do that. The law does allow for it. So I don't know that we need changes in law so much as we need changes in perceptions to help drive the need, help people understand the priority.
Sorry, a quick question there. So in that situation, and again, coming back to that question of like, how do we reduce this happening again, right? And where are those relationships with this kid? In that situation, when you all figure out where a kid is and you've obtained the warrant, is there communication back to that foster family, back to that residential treatment facility, et cetera, to play a role in how you then go interact with that child? Or is that sort of like you're in the system now, and the system's like you've involved the police, and the police are going to go do their thing, and we'll deliver the kid when we get them? Like, what's the interaction there between those systems?
Yeah, so there's
that because I heard that from someone earlier around like, what are we doing to ensure that those that have that relationship? So I just want to ask that.
That's a good question, and we're the interagency relationship there, or discussion there, is very limited. And Denver, I'm fortunate, I have a closer relationship with a lot of the caseworkers and casework supervisors, so we do have more communication than I think others may have. I know when I talk to some of these other human services agencies, they're dealing with multiple law enforcement agencies and all the staff turnaround, so there's not a personal connection that often happens like I have with Anna. But and in the system, the way our NCIC system works is it's more akin to like just data. Who's missing? Who should we call? And in many jurisdictions, when a child is found, the first call goes to, we would call it the RPN. So it's the code name for the field that contains the reporting party's name, RPN, and it has a phone number in there. And CBI pushes hard and actually now mandates that we have that contact information in there. And so when that first patrol officer responds, they make contact with a reporting party, and that might be staff, it might be a foster family, or if it's not institutional related, it might just be the parents. But they'll pick a name and a phone number, and so we don't have it standardized on what they should put in there. So some officers will do better about who they pick. They'll pick like a daytime manager, or other officers might pick the overnight staff who never answers their phone and give a desk phone number that never gets picked up. But then that information goes in, and there's definitely a separation there. For many agencies, there's no follow-up on runaway reports. It's left as an NCIC, CCIC transaction, and nothing further happens. In Denver, we do a little bit more. I wouldn't say a lot more. We do a little bit more in our record keeping and availability, and we try to make ourselves available to caseworkers so they have that central contact point. But that doesn't happen that happens through relationship building. It doesn't happen through a system. And then that when the child is actually picked up, there's no guarantee that the officers will know to call human services. It will often be that they'll call the RPN, and then if the RPN or that reporting party doesn't answer, then they'll call human services, because now they have an abandoned child and they can't babysit all night. And then human services puts it together and gets the kid to where they need to go, or helps the officer find that.
Gotcha.
And that's a tension point between human services and law enforcement, because the last thing a cop who's hearing these 911 calls and people being beaten and stabbed wants to do is sit with a 16-year-old runaway in the back of their car for 3 hours while human services puts it together and points them to another county. Like, that cop is super frustrated at that point. And so that worries me, because that's when cops say, oh, well, you're just a runaway, you need to go home. And they drive off to the other call. And then we're not serving the needs of that kid. And that's anecdotal. But but it's a worry that I always have.
Yeah. I appreciate you naming that tension too, right? We've got representation from all sides here. So it's important to just kind of name some of those tensions that we know and some of those tensions that folks might not know. I've seen a lot of hands raised, questions or comments. I'm going to start with Elizabeth, then Lynette, and then Beth. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yes, Brian, first of all, I just want to say that I have the utmost respect for you as law enforcement and all of the officers out there, because I can understand how frustrating it must be to have these quote real crimes going on and then have to deal with our kids. But my question is about the reporting. So you said that if you get a runaway report, you put it into the system so that anybody that picks up this kid would know who to contact, or at least where the report generated. Is that correct? So I guess my question is that something new that's been implemented, or did my situation just fall through the cracks? Because my son was in a hospital. He was hit by a car 4 hours after he ran and was in the trauma unit for 26 hours before anyone could locate me. They had to post on Facebook. So, I mean, there was no information, even though DPD had a runaway report, there was seemingly no information they could track to find out who he was. Is that a fluke, or can you speak to that? I mean, I'm not personally that you're responsible. But.
I completely understand, and that's one of the. So I'll bring a corollary to that. Human Services often is dealing with families, and there's families and domestic violence incidents, and one of my daily calls, like really it is daily, I get an email of, is there a protection order? So here's this agency, this statewide agency that's responsible for helping to protect families and protect children in domestic violence incidents. And they have no idea if there's a protection order that exists, but I know because it's in my law enforcement database. The missing person systems is the same way. I don't know your case specifically, so please don't accept this as some sort of like explanation around your situation, but what you described to me, I can see that happening. And I have seen stuff like this happen where the child is in a law enforcement database, but nobody calls the cops. The kid's just been hit by a car, and what do we need the cops for? The cops might be out on the scene doing something. The cops don't know who this kid is either, because often children don't carry identification with them. And so we may not be able to connect the individual, the victim, with a name that then gets to a cop, so the cop can then check the database, and then those connections start to come together.
So,
go ahead.
So is there, I mean, one of the issues, I guess, was that the accident was in Wheat Ridge and Denver PD had the runaway report. So is it that those counties or cities don't communicate those reports? It's been suggested that if you were to share the runaway reports with all the surrounding areas, that it would heighten police awareness and would possibly result in a more in a higher use of force situation.
Yes, first of all, I agree. I generally buy off on the idea that more information to the lowest level gives us better successes. That's what I generally believe. I also am a detective. I guard my information just a little bit for criminal investigations, because I also know that if people know things, then they won't tell me what the truth is. They'll tell me what they think I want to hear or what they want the outcome to be. And so I'm cautious, but any comments around law enforcement not sharing runaway information really isn't well founded. And the reason that is because of this nationwide NCIC CCIC system. So we don't share everything with other law enforcement in the same way that Trails does. So I know that as caseworkers, they can look inside of Trails, they can see the entire assessment by some other county and other caseworkers with certain like restricted or privatized kind of data exceptions. In law enforcement, we don't have that. Again, it's all local. So the Denver Police Department uses one brand of records management system. Lakewood uses a different brand. Boulder uses a different brand. So there's all sorts of options. Some agencies are still on paper for that matter. So we don't necessarily share all of our data in the same way that other agencies do. However, we do share some specific criminal justice information. So if we issue an arrest warrant, or if the court in our jurisdiction issues an arrest warrant, that will go into this statewide CCIC system. If the arrest warrant is of severe enough status, it will be transferred into the NCIC, the nationwide system. Missing people, including missing juveniles, automatically rate for entry directly into the federal system, the NCIC system. So the moment we put a missing person, juvenile or otherwise, into the CCIC system, every police officer everywhere in the country has access to that information instantly. So that, like, if we, the discussion about if some other agency had known he was missing, an outcome might have been different. Every agency had access to that, presuming that he made it onto NCIC initially. And that's federal law, and now state law mandates that for children, that entry has to happen within 2 hours, and for adults, it has to happen within 8 hours. So we've kind of, the state legislature sort of fixed that a little bit. And all agencies should be coming into compliance if they were at all out of compliance. And most of this is kind of an automated process for many agencies. Again, I'm lucky. I have a lot of privilege with being in a large agency. My officers at the patrol level key stuff in, and then it just transfers all the way up. It gets a couple of eyeballs on it, but there's no retyping, no rehashing, no paperwork slowdown, no lost in the mail slowdown. It all just makes it on. And usually I can say that somebody's in our NCIC system within about an hour or so of being reported missing and having an officer arrive. And that's a problem right now, is that there's a delay in response. You mentioned, officers wanting to deal with more serious crimes. Honestly, like every situation is important to us. I don't want you to think that some situations are more important than others. Missing children are an important part of what we do. We unfortunately are stuck in a spot where we have to prioritize that versus someone being shot or stabbed, and we're trying to prioritize that. But in Denver, again, every agency is different, but in Denver, we do prioritize missing children, especially when they're young.
I'm going to, Sergeant Cotter, thanks for that. And Elizabeth, thanks for your question. We've got about 10 minutes left. And obviously, Brian, you're a popular human to ask questions of. And so I want to be able to, I see Beth and Kevin still with their hands up. So want to go there, but also just a heads up to Dennis, would love to hear from the CDHS perspective as well. Haven't heard from you, and so wanted to bring you into this conversation as well. Any of these questions that you feel like you could speak to, or anything in response from the CDHS perspective. So, but Beth, and then Kevin, and then let's move it on and go from there. Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on, Sergeant Carr, I agree with you. We have a lot of resources in Denver, and obviously my department partners with your detectives regarding youth that have run, but those, and then my caseworkers do outreach to the family and the youth, but any youth that are system involved get screened out. We make that notification. So with the out-of-home placement, we wouldn't be doing any outreach. And so I know we're working on trying to team up with DHS to maybe do some more outreach with that. But in regards to Denver, we do not have a standard juvenile assessment center. So we don't have a place where we can bring these youth when they're located, and DPD won't transport. And that's not just DPD. There's other agencies, law enforcement agencies, that won't transport, and it's due to staffing issues. So they're making that notification to either the parent, guardian, or in this case, probably DHS. And so I know within my department, we are looking at trying to establish a more traditional JAC where DPD could then transport that youth to a safe location. Because obviously DHS, if there's only so many emergency response caseworkers, and if there's a youth or if there's an infant that they're responding out on, then the juvenile is going to probably have to wait. And that's again where that time eats up. And so that's the direction I think where DPD or Denver as a whole is lacking, but we are working on.
Thanks, Beth, for naming that too. I think, Kevin, go ahead. Seeing your hand up too.
Yeah, Brian, just wanted to clarify a point. you made a point about the way you treat kids that are over 12 and under 12, which makes perfect sense. But you talked a little bit about kids in placement, maybe aren't in the criminal judgment system. If I understood you correctly, kind of have a right to walk away or something. And I've heard a CDHS representative on the news a couple of times make that same point. So could you just clarify what you were trying to say there? So I want to know if there's some law or rule or if that's an internal standard or what it is.
I appreciate you giving me a chance to clarify that. It is kind of an internal standard, and it's about prioritizing the efforts. So when is it that we feel like a child will generally be at a higher risk category? And so we call them extenuating factors. So we'll look at, say, a senior who has Alzheimer's as an emergency situation. If they walk off from their care facility, an 11-year-old who walks off from their care facility, foster home, parents' home, we consider that to be an extenuating circumstance, and we call detectives out to respond on that. If the child left of their own volition at age 12, then they're considered 12 or older. Then we consider them to be a runaway. So it's not that we don't believe them to be safe out in the community as a 12-year-old managing themselves. It's that we choose to not prioritize as highly those responses. Those cases still come to detectives. I still assign a detective to each of them. We still reach out to family. We look to possible locations that the child may be at. We help facilitate patrol response if there's a way to get the child back into custody that we know about. But we don't get everybody out of bed at night if a 12-year-old leaves. Does that answer your question?
It does. That's perfect, and that makes perfect sense. How does CDHS feel about it? I mentioned something that Minna, what's her last name? Minna from CDHS said on the 9 News expose about runaways that was done a couple of years ago, where she said, well, kids have rights, right? And so they can walk away from these facilities if there's, no court holding them there, is the way I took it. Is that really the way you see it, or is that, that's always been a concern of mine. I've never understood where that comes from.
I'm seeing Lynette with her hand raised, and then that'll be a good transition to bring in Dennis. Go ahead, Lynette.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not so much seen as a right that they have the right to walk away from placement. It's that we do not have the right to lock them. So we can't lock the fence, we can't lock the doors to keep a youth or a child in a placement. So it's a civil liberty. Youth do have the right to run away. There are kids that run away from very abusive homes, and we don't want to make that a crime. And that has been the philosophy for decades now, is that shouldn't be a crime. It's more of a mental health issue or a safety issue. And sometimes youth leave abusive placements. I don't believe that that's a rampant issue in Colorado. I don't think it has been for quite some time, but it used to be in the 60s and the 70s for sure. And so it's not that they have the right to run, it's that we do not have the right to prevent them from running by locking them.
Thanks, Lynette. Go ahead, Kevin, sorry.
How about by stopping them or blocking them from running?
I think that's a great question.
That's probably more a question for me, is my guess, but
yeah,
unless you want to go ahead.
So I'll just, Dennis, let me just chime in here. I mean, I deal with I'm David Lee with Division of Youth Services. We work with a lot of our contracted agencies at county departments also. When you talk about blocking them or getting in their way, more than 90% of the time that will turn into a physical altercation, and that is something we do not want to happen. There's a lot of liability that falls into that situation when I think about contracted residential placements and those staff members. All it takes is something to get a little out of hand on that physical altercation, and there will be a lot more issues when it comes to licensing and lawsuits.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you jumping in. Dennis, want to bring you in both on that question, but also more broadly to this conversation.
So, well, I think Dave said it well, and also Lynette did too. But you can, in order to like physically restrain a child or youth, the statute's very clear. There has to be an imminent threat of bodily harm to self or others, and the present means to carry out that threat of bodily harm. The word emergency is not in the statute. It's imminent threat of physical harm to self or others. So runaways don't meet that threshold. So and that's just the statute. So it would be illegal for a staff in a facility to physically intervene to stop a child or youth from running at this point in Colorado.
And Dennis, can you just, you point to the statute, but also just want to say from like, I think this is what Dave was alluding to, is the reason behind that is really around all the challenges that could then bring, both from like a licensing perspective, liability, he said, she said situation, and the safety of a child in that situation. So I just want to make sure we're like naming, with Kevin's question, like what is behind that statute? Is there anything else that you would really highlight of like where that came from?
Well, I would say that it comes from a place of restraints have been abused in the past, and the federal government realized that, and so they put in place, through Medicaid, ways to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion, and it's all around like the rights of the child or youth, and adults too, because the statute's the same, and then just around safety, because there's not a real safe way to take down a 16-year-old male. Somebody's going to get hurt. If anybody, I don't know how many of you have seen restraints of children and youth, but they're not smooth. They're not easy. They never go the way that you think they're going to go. So it's generally around safety, is what I would say.
Thanks, Dennis. I want to name, with this question, I know we have lots of questions and comments, et cetera. And one of the purposes of this conversation was to surface where this task force wants to continue to go deeper on. So we'll be returning to some of these, clearly the conversation with Sergeant Cotter, a lot of folks had a lot of questions, a lot of comments. That's something that we can dive deeper on. So, this is part of this process. So this isn't the end of this conversation or these questions. And I just wanted to name that because we are going to take a little bit of a break here in a minute. And then we have some speakers that Jennifer will introduce, but Stephanie, wanted to give you a chance to jump in. I saw your hand raised, and Renee, and then we're going to take a quick break. You're on mute, Stephanie.
Thank you. I just wanted to let the group know that these issues regarding laws and restraints and seclusion, we will all be discussing. We will actually be presenting an overview of the law and what it says. I think great caution must always be used when we talk about, imminent threat of harm to self or others. That's a discretionary definition under the law. In other words, there is no standard, right? The law is not standard, right? So for as many people that are on this line, we will all define eminent differently. That's just the truth of it. So again, I always caution about the law says. The law can be interpreted by people who interpret it and train on it, and that can look different from agency to agency, jurisdiction, state to state. So I just wanted to caution us about that. And then secondly, that we will be providing a full overview, and we're looking for, to be honest, some legal interpretation as we present that in the upcoming sessions for that exact reason.
Stephanie, appreciate you naming that. There's a lot of nuance there. So we'll think naming that we'll go deeper there and make sure we have the right folks at the table for that conversation. So appreciate that. Dave, seeing your hand, and then we'll, and I also want to name Dave. Dave had mentioned this, and I think Renee had also, I saw a couple of people in the chat around, where's DYS in this conversation? We are going to bring DYS into this conversation from the unique perspective, Division of Youth Services and kids in the juvenile justice system, and how that's a little bit different. But we didn't want to be too broad here. We wanted to get a little bit more specific. So Dave, appreciate your question or comment now, but wanted to just name that for the group that we're going to be spending more time with you in future meetings. Go ahead.
Sure thing. Thanks, Trace. Stephanie, while you were talking just right there around the upcoming meetings, we will discuss statute, laws, interpretation. I think it's really important that we have discussion around volume 7 through CDHS. I mean, that's really what guides residential placements more than statutes even. I mean, because that's an interpretation of statute that CDHS has taken from statutes and laws and put into rules that they have for out of volume 7 for our residential placements. I think that's pretty important for us to start reviewing also.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That is a big part of it. The presentation that you will be receiving, the group will involves not only analysis of volume 7, but state law and federal laws as well. So we will definitely be covering as well. There's those DHS laws and regs, right? And then there's also mental health and behavioral health regs. It's pretty layered upon layer. So we will be working through the Children's Code, the Criminal Justice Code, as well as the behavioral health regs and laws that govern all of this. So yes, stay tuned for the upcoming legal analysis.
Stay tuned. I love it, Stephanie. Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute stretch break. I know we've got a couple of folks that are speaking to us next on the line. Thank you for your patience. We're going a little over, but want to give them a little bit of a chance to get some water, and then we'll come back and Jen will introduce who we've got next. So 5 minutes, come back at 9:37 and we'll get going. Thanks so much. All right, going to bring us back. I'll give us just a minute. I want to give us a reminder, other than our speakers we're about to hear from. Would love to use this as a reminder for folks. If you are on the task force and you're in an okay place to do so, if you could turn your camera on, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you're a member of the public, to turn your camera off, so that it just helps us from a facilitation perspective know who's on the task force as we're having these kind of more organic conversations. So on the task force, turn your camera on if at all possible. And if you're not on the task force, other than our speakers, you can go ahead and turn those off. All right, Jen, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our next conversation.
Great, thank you, Trace. I invited our speakers. They very graciously accepted our invitation because I think, again, there's a lot of interest in what we're trying to do with our task force. Their research really captured much of the information that you had discussed at prior meetings as far as wanting to better understand. This was trends over time, who runs, what factors help us understand how to prevent and respond to runaway behavior. And interestingly, why and how the term runaway obscures some of the larger issues and reasons why children go missing from out-of-home placement. So their presentation provides a context and an overview, which we can then compare our Colorado-specific data and information that we learn about in subsequent meetings. So to introduce our speakers, we have Carolyn Branscombe. She received her Master's of Science degree in Criminology and Criminal Justice from Florida Atlantic University in 2020. She's currently a third-year doctoral student in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's a research assistant in the school's Victimology and Victim Studies Research Lab. And her research interests include violence against women, victimization, and sexual assault case processing. Some of her recent research has been featured in Child Abuse and Neglect, Race and Justice, and Journal of Interpersonal Violence. We also have Tara Richards, PhD, who is a distinguished associate professor in the same school, the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's also faculty lead in the school's Victimology and Victim Studies Research Lab. Her research and teaching focuses on prevention, intervention, and system response to sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect. Some of her recent research has been featured in Criminology and Public Policy, Justice Quarterly, and Crime and Delinquency. She is also a co-editor of the book Sexual Victimization Then and Now. So thank you again for being with us today, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'm Tara Richards. Most of this presentation is going to be featuring Carolyn, who, as Jennifer noted, is a PhD student in our research lab. And this is really her research. when Carolyn's done, I'm going to talk a little bit about a Nebraska specific study that we worked on. But Carolyn's going to present an analysis of the national data so that you guys get a good sense of what's going on sort of nationally. And she can talk a little bit about the trends from 2010 to 2019 that we've seen in that national data. So Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you. Does she have the ability to share her screen? Because she has some slides. So, all right, awesome.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Richards and Jennifer, for that introduction. Let me get my slides put up. Screen 2. And I don't think I'll be able to see you guys. So if you have a question during, just feel free to unmute or, have one of the hosts flag me down somehow. But
I can help you if I see somebody. I'll interrupt you.
That would be perfect. Thank you so much. So yes, as Dr. Richards said, I will be talking about some research that we conducted where we took some national data and looked at it over 10 years to see what trends of running away from foster care looked like. We were in the data that I will be presenting on is the adoption and foster care analysis and reporting system. Also, I'll refer to it as AFGARS, in order to help us understand some of the characteristics associated with running away from foster care placement. So I'm sure the overall scope of the problem is not lost to this group. So I will go through this part quickly, but as we know, there are probably estimated over 400,000 children in foster care at any given time. And across these jurisdictions, there's been an estimated 3% of children who will run away or go missing from care. Characteristics that are associated with running away, it seems that girls are more likely than boys to run away. Children who are older are more likely to run away. Those experiencing placement disability, behavioral issues, and of course, a prior running away history have all predicted future running away behavior in the literature so far. And unfortunately, these children are at greater risk of immediate and long-term consequences, such as alcohol and drug abuse, victimization, because they're vulnerable when they're on the streets and alone, contact with the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. So research tells us that the context in which children run away from care is very complex, but we generally find that it falls into two categories, which is running to, trying to access something behavior, or running from, trying to avoid something behavior. And so running to would mean that they want access to something or someone. So this could be being placed in foster care and then running back to their family of origins, or seeking out siblings, friends, those types of people. They could also be running from something such as feeling unsupported. They might be rebelling against the new environment or restricted autonomy. And they also might be fleeing some other type of abusive situation. And so prior research tells us that children who run away are more vulnerable to harm and in need of support. Yet research has not been conducted on children who run away, or not a lot of research has been conducted. The studies that exist consist of primarily case review records, interviews with children, caregivers, staff, single state or single jurisdiction type studies. But with one exception, there's only been one study so far before ours that looked at this data on a national scale. And so that's what we wanted to do with this study. So our purpose was to provide a 10-year follow-up using 2010 to 2019 data. We also assess the replicability, right, of all of this prior research. Are we finding on a national scale what all these other studies have found on a smaller scale? And so really quickly, just to talk about our methods, the AFGARS data mandates that all states report all children involved in foster care programs every year. And so for 2019, we had just over 597,000 children in our sample. Our dependent variable was runaway status. So at the time that the data were collected in 2019, had this child been identified as someone who had ran away from care or was currently running away from care versus in some kind of placement setting. We then used a logistic regression to examine the relationship between all of the independent and control variables you see on the slide, and which of these, increased or decreased the likelihood that that child ran away from care in 2019. And so the findings I present focus on our 2019 analysis just for the sake of time, but our paper did include analyses from 2010 to 2019 So we'd be happy to elaborate on some more of the trends we saw or answer any questions folks might have. But I do want to note that what we found in 2019 was pretty stable for what we saw over the 10-year period, which is why it's a good year to pull to focus on the analysis for. But yes, we can talk more about 10-year trends. And so the first thing I'll show you guys is that children running away from care has been steadily declining on a national scale over the last 10 years. You can see from 2010, we started with a prevalence of about 1.4% of children involved in foster care running away. In 2019, that was actually just under 1%. And the 10-year average is 1.14% of all children involved in foster care ran away had run away. So now I'm going to present findings from our analyses. So just as a disclaimer, I'm presenting odds ratios, which can be interpreted as a percentage of increased or decreased risk of the likelihood of running away from care. You don't have to consider yourself to be a stats person to understand like this type of stats, and I'll break it down as I go through the results. So for example, we found that children identifying as Black or African American was associated with an 89% increase in the likelihood of running away from care when compared to white children involved in foster care. Children identifying as Hispanic were 82% more likely to run away from care. Children identifying as an other race in the AFGARS data were 53% more likely, and Native American children were 45% more likely to run away from care. All of these were compared to a white children reference group. In terms of age, for every year older a child was, on average, they were 61% more likely to run away from care. This means the older you got, the higher risk you were from running away became, which is what we've seen in the literature. We also had a measure for age that the child was first removed from a family or placement of origin and placed into foster care. And we found that children were also more likely to run away from care the older they were when they were first removed. But as you can see, to a lesser degree than just the current age of the child, age at first removal was associated with a 1% increase in odds of running away for every year older someone was. Girls were 29% more likely to run away than boys, which is also what we've seen in past research. And lastly, in terms of the original family structure that the child was removed from, we see that compared to single female-headed households, removing children from single male households increased the odds of a child running away by 14%, whereas being removed from a married couple household lowered the odds of running away by 19%. Figure 2 presents these same odd ratios for all the reasons a child welfare agency identified for justifying removing that child away from a family or placement of origin. And so in this regard, children who were removed from the home due to child substance abuse, parental abandonment, child behavioral problems, and neglect were all associated with a greater likelihood of running away from care compared to children who were not removed for these reasons. So more specifically, we can see that a child being removed from the home due to the child's substance abuse problems was associated with a 65% increase in the likelihood of running away from care. This was one of our largest effects that we saw in our analyses. To a lesser degree, abandonment was associated with a 38% increase in likelihood of running away, and behavioral problems was associated with a 31% increased risk of running away. Oh, and neglect was associated with a 17% increased risk of running away. In contrast, children who were removed from the home due to parental substance abuse or the child having a disability, they were less likely to run away compared to children who did not experience this. As you can see, for example, child disability was associated with a 29% less likelihood of running away from care. Notably, none of the other removal reasons were statistically significant. And all that means is that at least in our study, we can't confirm that they were or weren't associated with running away from care. And then lastly, figure 3 presents odd ratios for geographic location, placement instability, and diagnosed disabilities of the child and the effect these might have on running away. So compared to southern census regions, all other census regions were associated with an increased odds in running away. In terms of placement instability, for every one additional removal from family of origin, a child was 13% more likely to run away from care. And similarly, the number of prior placement settings a child had experienced over their course in the foster care system, it was associated with an increased risk of running away as well, just to a lesser degree. And then for each additional month spent in foster care, children were 6% less likely to run away from care. And lastly, other disability was the only disability category associated with any risk of running away, and it was associated with a decreased risk. So other disability was broadly referred to as whatever a state could not categorize into physical or intellectual disability. Some examples they provided was asthma, cancer, epilepsy, that sort of thing. I will note that the group of children who had a disability was relatively small. So it also could be they were just such a small group, we couldn't find a significant result. Now to summarize some of the key takeaways, our findings did generally replicate prior work and was which is consistent with the framework that children are often running away from care to access something or to avoid something. This understanding of running behavior was evident in our findings, in that we found several factors associated with an increased risk of running away. So for example, there were several children might be running, for example, we found that children may be at greater risk of running away when they were removed from a single parent household compared to married couples. This could potentially be indicative of a child having a caretaker role in the family and be attempting to reconnect with parents, guardians, siblings, or other family members. Furthermore, we found pronounced racial disparities in who was more likely to run away from care. So in this regard, Black children were at the greatest risk of running away, being 89% more likely. This was also one of our largest effect sizes that we saw in our study. Yes, sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit, but yeah, in terms of racial disparities, we saw that, 45% to 89%. It led to an increase of 45 to 89% in terms of running away behaviors. We also found that in terms of the reason the child was removed from their family of origin, there were some risk factors. For example, children who were brought into care due to neglect, research has found they might be running back to their families or siblings or familiar environments, which is consistent with what we found. If you remember, neglect was associated with a 17% increase in likelihood of running away. In contrast, child substance abuse had one of our strongest effect sizes, making the child 65% more likely to run away from care. So these children could be running to peers who also may engage in similar behavior, or they might be running from restrictions in foster care, preventing them, right, from engaging in that type of behavior. All measures of instability in foster care were associated with a greater risk of running away as well. So this is also in line with prior research that children who are frequently, experience this kind of shuffling through the system or any type of just instability, this is characterized as potentially a negative experience for them, thus prompting them to run away from the system. And so what are some next steps that we talked about in our paper? First, the context a child runs away from a care setting matters in terms of risk, and that they might be running for a variety of very complex reasons. However, our understanding of the characteristics associated with running behavior could allow us to build almost profiles, right, of children who are at the greatest risk of running away, which can help us focus resources and intervention strategies. So again, for example, the pronounced racial disparities we found and the association we found between child substance abuse disorders and running away tells us that these are some of the highest groups, or the highest risk groups of running away from care. For example, research tells us that people in general, but especially children suffering from substance abuse disorders, are not doing so in a vacuum. This could be a technique to cope from past trauma, violent experiences, etc. And when children who suffer from this are on the streets and not in a care setting, they're even more vulnerable to predatory individuals who may further victimize and harm them. And so if we remember that these, that these groups are at such a high risk of running away, this is a clear intervention point in which we can say, this child has a substance abuse problem, they're at a high risk of running away, and here are some interventions or, resources that we could direct towards them to minimize that risk. We were also told that you may be discussing the connotations associated with the term runaway. And so we did talk about that in our paper. The national data we used, AFGARs, only had a runaway category, interesting enough. And to our knowledge, there was nowhere in the code book where they distinguish between children who were missing from care versus maybe had run away. And so we find this problematic for a variety of reasons. First, we know that children who run away from care do so for very complex reasons. Yet the reality is once a child is missing from supervision, we don't always know prospectively, right, why they did this. Was it of their own free will? Like they just walked away from the care setting. Were they being coerced by an outside party that maybe has not come to the attention of care providers yet? We just know at that time that they're missing from care. And so let's say a child does run away for their own volition. They just walked away. Their characterization as a runaway puts the onus on the child for their own care, right? Or for, it almost puts the responsibility on them for running away. And so this can be really harmful because we know children are a vulnerable population. They aren't always making, right, the best decisions on their behalf, right? Their cognitive abilities haven't reached the point where maybe they're always making the best decisions. They need support from the system, especially when they've been removed from a familiar environment, even if that environment was abusive. And so for all these reasons, we argue that we should consider reframing language from runaway children or runaways to children who are missing from care, or at the very least have very clearly distinguish between those two groups of children. And so some limitations for a study that I'd like to acknowledge is that, as I've already talked about, right, children listed as having run away from care, as AFGAR does, we're not necessarily capturing children who are just going missing from care or distinguishing, is there really, what is the overlap in these phenomena realistically in jurisdictions? And so that's something that we could get better at when we collect data to make sure we have those clear definitions in place. Second, the AFGAR's data reflect point-in-time measurements. So this means that the child was listed as a runaway when the data was collected during the reporting period in 2019. However, we know that children running away or going missing, they return, they leave, they're found, they leave again. It's a very dynamic process. And so point-in-time estimates don't always reflect the dynamic nature of running behaviors. And so we should strive for capturing this dynamic process in future studies and future reporting practices. In terms of future research, more research is needed to understand when and how children are identified as a runaway versus missing from care and the consequences of such terminology. What we see so far is that individual jurisdictions have a lot of variation, right, in how they handle this and how they classify children as a runaway versus missing from care. And I'm sure you've already seen that in your own jurisdiction. But our knowledge is limited and not being captured by our national data collection efforts as far as how this decision-making occurs. Further, in an era where missing persons are receiving increased attention, we're confirming that racial minorities are at increased risk of going missing. And in these reports, we see that Black children are at the highest risk of going missing. So these two bodies of research coupled together indicates that there may actually be overlap, right, in research about Black children going missing from care and Black children running away from care. But we don't really treat it as one phenomena or a related phenomena yet. And so that's something that I think future research could do more work in terms of merging these bodies of literature and seeing where the overlap actually occurs. And so that's the end of my presentation. Dr. Richards will follow up with some conversation or with a study that she worked on in Nebraska. But yeah, feel free to ask us any questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. Dr. Richards, I'm wondering if it makes sense to kind of pause before we go into that next presentation and talk here, or if they kind of, if they're overlapping and we should have one conversation at the end.
So I'll kind of telescope for you guys and let you know the next thing I'm going to talk about is a state-based study where we started with official missing persons reports and then worked backwards to see whether or not kiddos that were officially reporting missing were with their family of origin or in an out-of-home care placement. So I think this time would probably be a great time to talk about any questions or thoughts that you guys have about sort of the national scope of data or how we could improve data collection. And then, maybe that will dovetail into sort of that, looking at the other side of the coin, right? Because these data start with the out-of-home care placement kids. And the next thing I want to talk about is starting with kids that are missing, right? That are officially reported missing. So same problem, but we're looking at it from sort of those two different perspectives.
Great. Yeah, I think that's, so let's pause then and respond. Carolyn, thanks for that well laid out report in data. I really appreciate that. I want to start first with reactions. If we have those, curious from folks' perspectives, like anything on there that you're like, this does not resonate with my experience, or yes, absolutely, this makes 100%. But would love to hear reactions first. Go ahead, Dave.
First, Carolyn, I just want to say this is fabulous. Thank you so much for doing this. I have worked for so many years within private residential and with the state with Division of Youth Services. I am not surprised by anything that you just brought up. I mean, I think the thing that I was thinking about as you're doing is like, we all have our own anecdotal information. Like, we believe this is why kids run away. This is what we think prompted it. But this really helps, I think, this task force to fine tune some of our direction on where we go with some of this. So I really appreciate the work you've done. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that very high compliment.
Thanks, Dave. Renee.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, also, Carolyn, thanks for presenting that. And again, kudos for that type of study, which, on a population where not a lot is known about them, as you pointed out. And like Dave said, I think it's great and helpful to see some description of what we're seeing in broad terms about these kids. I think also one of my takeaways from it is that as much as it shows characteristics and demographics of kids who might be at higher risk, and certainly if someone met a lot of those, check the boxes and a lot of those demographic variables, that might be certainly a way to hone in on kids at high risk. In some ways, the relative risk numbers to me also show how it truly could also be any kid, and how hard it is to actually predict. If someone's at 29% higher by gender, that doesn't mean that only girls run, but it means that they actually run pretty equally. Girls are slightly more likely, but actually pretty equally. So I feel like it also kind of just points out how hard it is to address this issue, because while there are things that bump up the risk some, it's not by huge factors that make it really easy to point out which kids are running. So I feel like it also helps to describe that phenomenon as well. The other thing I just wanted to comment on, and I think this has come up throughout our discussions of the task force, is sort of the concept of, the two categories of kids running to or running from. And I just wanted to raise, again, we've raised in previous meetings, I think sort of a third category that I think is really important, especially for some of these really high risk kids we're talking about, which is kids who it may not really be either, but kids who kind of, are overwhelmed in the moment. They might have a trauma history, their brain's kind of short circuit, or they're being very reactive to something in the moment. And it's a impulsive decision that might not really neatly fit into that category of running to or running from. And I think we just need to kind of, in my mind, that's an important group to be mindful of also.
Renee, I appreciate you bringing that up too. That, Carolyn, that did come up. She mentioned, in previous meetings. that, yeah, when we have kids with significant trauma in their background, that you often get them into these like fight or flight, moments, and it's there, when you, I think, I can't remember who it was, maybe Brandon, we were talking to some folks with lived experience, and they were like, I don't know what I was thinking, I had to get out of there. I felt like unsafe. So Renee, I appreciate you bringing that up, that definitely surfaced in this group. I'm going to go to Kevin and then Jana. I also want to just name, there's a lot of folks on this call I haven't heard anything from today. So if you were on the task force, I'm going to say, come off of camera and jump into this discussion, because I think there's a lot to respond to here, but go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have you or anyone else looked at the issue of danger to the community created by runaways, to stay on the run, either crime or, well, usually crime, I would think, but anyone follow up on that? You talked about the static nature, maybe that's never been well followed up on as far as research.
Yeah, I know personally I've not done that type of study yet, although I think that would be really interesting. There is some work out there about contacts with the criminal justice system, that, children who run away are more likely to come in contact with the criminal justice system for a variety of reasons. But I think to your point, that because so much of the research we have right now are point in time estimates, it is really hard to get at that dynamic nature, right? Because just because a child had been involved with the criminal justice system at one point doesn't mean they did it when they ran away. And so I think that's a very interesting line of future research that we could be collecting in the future to get at that more.
Jana and then Becky. And Jana, am I saying your name right?
Yes, Jana, like banana. Yes, perfect. I love the fact that we're taking away the stigma of words. I think that is so important with kids. Just even calling them foster children, I think, is horrible because it sets them apart from a regular child. So I love that you are addressing, not calling them runaways, which is, he's a runaway. It puts them in this negative, horrible category again, when most of the time we know there's something going on inside, which leads me to my second point, which is I would love to know if we could even peek inside and see, why are African American kids running away at such a higher stat? Why are girls? Is it because girls have an easier time getting someone to take them in? I mean, why? I would love to know that heart of this is, why is that differential there?
So I'll jump in and say, the national data is pretty limited, right? Because it's, it really is,
nobody cares. That's
right. And it is, it's coming in from child welfare organizations, and it's a pretty basic sort of checkbox kind of data collection mechanism. Those types of questions really have to be answered with better, data that most of the time has case files associated with it, right? So that you can really sort of dig into that context.
I wasn't implying, why didn't you cover that?
No.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, the next step I would love to see after this, which is like, this is a shock to me that you even did a study on it. And I would just love, like, you've whetted my interest to peek inside and see, why are these groups so much more likely to run away?
So in Omaha, we have one of the largest child advocacy centers in the country. It's called Project Harmony. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I said to you guys on this meeting is that I really hope that Jennifer can connect you. I'm happy to help connect you guys. We have a missing youth program at Project Harmony, and it came out of a internal audit that our Omaha Police Department Special Victims Unit did a couple of years ago. They sort of did an analysis of their internal data on children they were picking up as runaways, right? And they started noticing, like, yes, there's a portion that are system involved, but there's this other portion of kids that they were picking up as runaways, oftentimes repeatedly picking up that were not at that moment system involved. And we know that these kids, that oftentimes kids that are running away, maybe they're system involved today, but 30 days from now, they're not, right? And that impacts their ability to get services. And so that was really sort of the point of this missing youth program, was really to try to identify mechanisms to keep children's services and support networks going, even if they came back to their family of origin, right? Because many times these families need services, even if it doesn't rise to the level of taking a child out of the home or having that family system involved, right? So I think that Project Harmony sort of tried to think out of the box in terms of how can we keep families connected to services, even if they are not, they don't reach the level that CPS needs to have them involved in their services. So I do think that there are sort of ways to think about this beyond, some of the things that we've always been doing, right? In terms of children that are in out-of-home care placement or CPS involved. Even though I know that's, maybe the main focus of this task force, it's the dynamic nature of the situation that I think we really tried to highlight in that paper, is that, what's happening with these families today doesn't necessarily mean that that's what happened yesterday or is going to happen tomorrow.
Thanks, Tara. I'm gonna, so I'm seeing one hand raised, gonna go to Becky in a second. And then Carolyn, I would love to bring back up your slide on that next steps piece and get some specific reactions to that. So I'm just giving you a heads up because I think you're giving some concrete suggestions and I would love to hear from this group, their reactions to that. And then Tara, I wanna come back to you for this other presentation that we talked about. So Becky, my old teacher hat, I would say, I haven't heard from you today, so I'd throw you a piece of gum and say thanks for raising your hand. So Becky, would love to hear what you have to say.
I knew you were going to call on me. Thank you, Trace. Dr. Richardson, Carolyn, your research is really great. So thank you so much. And I think that'll be really helpful for us as a task force to sort of figure out what kinds of other things we need to dig into. I am the executive director of CAFCA, the Colorado Association of Family and Children's Agencies. So I work for the providers. What we're hearing from the providers, even though we have fewer kids in care right now in residential than we've had in many, many years, decades, we are seeing a level of severity that our people are reporting anecdotally is a higher severity than we've seen. And our children's hospital here in Colorado has declared a children's mental health crisis more than a year ago. We've had a lot of media about that. So we have fewer kids in care, but the kids that we have are more severe and have higher needs. My question for you guys, and also for our state partners in particular, is do we have good data on number of runs that we've seen just in the past couple of years since this mental health crisis has come about? So I don't know that we have good data, but I think that's something we should really get our arms around. The other piece is Trace put in the chat these questions, and I love the question of what happens during the time the child is missing. I don't know how well our agencies track that. Brandon might be able to speak to that. I don't think we are good at that. And I think we need to get better at that, just from the agency side of things, but also from our state partners and law enforcement partners. What we know about that piece, I'm very intrigued about and want to learn more about. But thank you for your research, and I hope we can dig into those areas.
So one thing I will say is, in addition to all the other limitations that we've talked about, the 2019 data is the most recent data that's available. You guys know this. All of you that, work in an agency and do any kind of reporting, there's such a time lag with data, right? So it'll be 4 years before I can tell you what happened in 2021 or 2022, right? And that's really unfortunate because, yes, I completely agree with you. It would be fantastic if, we could have that data in more of a real time scenario so that we could say, okay, what has happened since 2020, right? Because we know that with COVID, with kids being out of school, so there was a huge impact on, what was going on, especially in high need families, right? And with kids and really understanding what was going on with those kids. So the answer to your question is no, unfortunately, we don't have good data on that. And we're not going to have good data on that for years.
Thank you.
Yeah. So can we bring that slide up on the next steps? I want to, just spend a couple minutes getting some reactions to this. I'm thinking this first one, Brandon, I'm going to pick on you because I'm thinking of like, what's your reaction as a provider who, you have I know a lot of it is about building a relationship. You have a kiddo that comes into your care. You want to know them, understand what their challenges are, understand what risks there are. But, what sort of value do you see in, this idea of like building a demographic profile of children of high risk, and how would that, support or create more work, or, what do you see in that suggestion? And I welcome anybody else too, but Brandon, you came to top of mind just because of, he's the executive director of a residential treatment facility here in Colorado, just for the presenter's perspective. So Brandon, going to give you a chance, but anybody else for this first one?
Well, I think any information is good information and can help. I don't think there's a particular, I don't think you can get boxed into a particular like rhyme or reason, or pigeonhole why a kid leaves or runs, or, the type of kid that's leaving. So, I don't know how helpful predictive factors it's going to be a particular kid is going to be running. I think all kids are at risk for particular behaviors in the right setting, so in the right situation. So, but the more information, the better. So I think it's good, but I also think that the more you put on anyone, I think requires resources, and I think that's the challenge and difficulty of things. So so the more you ask of providers, I think is it's going to make it more difficult for people. So I think that can be a challenge as well. So collecting information, and we don't always get accurate information coming in, information and intakes and things like that. So it might be harder, to get the right information, but we don't always get to, how many runs, we get information with kids' history in there, and, kids that have history of running isn't always accurate when they come in the door. So it's tough to have that kind of stuff, but yeah. And then to Becky's point, I do think one that she was making, one thing I want to point out is I do think one piece that definitely would be interesting is what are the kids doing while they're out on the run. I think that's one of my big concerns, because what one of our big challenges is that kids, when they're in that state, when they are running, they tend to, they're in irrational thought, and an irrational emotion, and once they get out there, it continues to escalate. It doesn't tend to de-escalate without intervention, and it gets riskier and riskier, and that's the challenge, and it tends to get worse, and so their behaviors and choices get more dangerous in my experience. I don't have any data on that, but from the longer they're out there, the more dangerous it gets for them, whether by their by them putting themselves in position, or by them doing things that they hurt themselves or others, even if it's not in the moment.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that. And I want to pick on, and then I'm going to bring us back to Tara, but I want to pick on Michelle and Lynette from a county DHS perspective. I'm thinking of, you've got a kid who's run from X amount of homes, and you obviously, there like some of the challenges there, like how much information you give to a foster family, for instance, that's looking at bringing a kiddo in. Do you say, hey, this kid's run from 6 homes? And it's like there's all these like competing factors, I know, for you also, like what already exists from like the building demographic profiles of children at high risk of running internally, but also like externally with whoever their placement's going to be, whether that's a foster home or residential treatment facility. Like what's DHS's role that already exists there? Curious to hear from you all. Lynette, I'm seeing your hand up, and then I'll go to Michelle.
Okay, well, I have my hand up with a different question, but I'll chime in later. I think the protocols is, and the expectation is that you tell providers everything. You tell them the good, the bad, the ugly, because they can't serve a child and they can't adequately meet their needs if they don't understand where that child is coming from. So you tell them about the runs, you tell them about what happened, what you know about what happened while they were on the run, and you tell them all of it. You tell the foster parents, this child may run from your home. This is where they typically go. This is what you need to do if they do abscond from your home. I keep saying run because usually it is literally a run at first. Sometimes it's just a nice calm walk away. But you tell the providers everything. That's a huge liability issue to leave out information. And I don't know if Michelle has a different opinion or what their protocol is there.
No, I agree. We try to be very transparent, not only with the elopement behaviors, mental health behaviors, also strengths, like what this kid really thrives on. It's just the nature of what's going on right now. We don't have foster homes. Like, I can't find a foster home for a teenager, especially if there's running. That is like an automatic denial from a lot of placements. And so it's hard because these kids are often like craving like stability, right? They're craving a safe place to go, but they're having to quote stabilize before somebody will take them. And it's just, it's frustrating, but I agree. We have to be honest because like Lynette said, like the caregivers and foster parents and treatment providers, they need to know what they're dealing with. Like, what are their triggers? What happened right before the kid took off the last time? So yeah.
Appreciate that. Lynette, I know you had a question, and then Tara, we're going to come back to you for this other presentation. So go ahead, Lynette.
So it kind of comes back to the risk factor that substance use by the youth has towards running. For those that don't know, Colorado does not currently have an inpatient adolescent substance abuse treatment program. There are communities with very few, if any, minor specialized to serve minors with substance abuse issues. Adolescent detox is like missing, while fentanyl use is going up and methamphetamine use is going up. It's a horrible storm. I'm not going to call it a perfect storm. It's a horrible storm. But the other issue is because, and I think this is a consequence of the Families First legislation, trying to reduce the number of, had great intent of reducing the number of kids in congregate care. The unintended consequence is that it reduced the amount of care that is available for these youth. And programs are saying they will not take a youth unless they've been sober for 30 days. I have a youth that I'm working with right now that I've been looking for placement for 4 months. Severe methamphetamine addiction. Also using fentanyl and acid and this and that. And he has ran away from his home. He's going to end up getting committed and coming to Dave Lee. That's the bottom line, Dave. Sorry, but he needs you. But there's also no programs that specialize in substance abuse treatment for these juveniles anymore. Even the only program that I found that would even consider taking him, I was going to have to get outpatient services contracted in. So that's a huge systemic issue in Colorado on a child that this research is telling us, on a group of children that this research is telling us is at high risk for going missing from care.
Thanks, Lynette.
One other question. In the research that you showed, Carolyn, there was something about the different, from the West, from the East, from different locations. Any hypotheses on why the West was so much higher than the other ones for risk of running?
So Dr. Richards is welcome to chime in because I know this is something that we had talked about. Because other studies had never really looked at census regions the way we did, it really did throw us for a loop. We weren't really sure if this was just an artifact of the data or was there something particularly going on. I think it would be more useful in the future to try to bring, and AFGARS doesn't do this, so this would be, or AFGARS does, we collapsed it for the study. But I think it would be interesting going forward to break it down by state, because then at least we could pinpoint like certain types of legislation that may or may not exist in certain states. But Dr. Richards, do you have anything to add to that?
The student has become the master. No, that would have been, I mean, I think that, Carolyn, that's your next study, right? I mean, one thing that looking at the national data does, it's great because now we have a national picture, but it masks all the state differences, right? So, I mean, even just a quick proportion by state would be super interesting, right? So what is the proportion of runaway youth for each state? Because obviously we have more kids and out of home placement from state to state, right? So we need that, but just knowing what the proportion is of kids that are in out of home care in each state, what proportion we're missing, or excuse me, we're missing from care. That's what I call it. When this data was collected, I think would be super interesting. But yes, I have no idea. I mean, it would be total speculation, whatever I said to you. I have no clue why we've got that concentration in Western states. But I agree, it's bananas and we should try to figure it out.
If y'all could get on that, that'd be great.
Yes, we will. I mean, we really could talk to you guys about this all day. We've been looking at missingness across a couple of different lenses, which is where my next, the next slides I want to show you. I've just got 2 slides. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to tell a group like this about the findings from another study that we did, which was really the first study. So a couple of years ago now, the state legislature in Nebraska, and what's happening here? Why am I not? I'm trying to go.
I think you're sharing now.
Yes. Can you? And now can you see my? There we go. Now you can just see the slide, right? And not my presentation view. Okay, great. A couple of years ago, the Nebraska legislature passed LB 154, which mandated the Nebraska State Patrol in collaboration with the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, which is our state body that is, located at our state capital. The Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs is the tribal entity that serves as the liaison between our 4 federally recognized tribes in the state of Nebraska and our Nebraska state government, right? So Nebraska State Patrol, Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs were mandated to conduct a study on the scope of missing Native American women and children in Nebraska. Now, of course, Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, Nebraska State Patrol, neither of these are research-based entities. There was no funding note for this legislation. So my colleague Emily Wright and I went to the National Institute of Justice. We got some funds so that we could bring research capacity to this really, really important bill, right? Because we wanted this done right. So I say all this because this is where my start with studies on missing persons started. I never meant to study missing persons. I'm a sexual assault, child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, intimate partner violence researcher. That's what I do. But this was just too good of an opportunity. And I knew that it was going to overlap with so many of my research interests. My colleague, Dr. Wright, is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. So we wanted to do this for our state and for American Indian Alaska Native people. So part of the study, what we did was we collected 4 point in time counts of missing persons in the state of Nebraska. Okay, so we collected data on who was missing from the state of Nebraska over 4 different points over the course of a year, mimicking what researchers do when we try to count people who are experiencing homelessness, right? Like this is a hidden population. If I knew how many people were missing, they wouldn't be missing, right? So this is where we were kind of going with our methods here. So we dig into these data and we realize pretty quickly into this study that the majority of our missing persons were minors, right? And again, I wasn't a missing persons researcher. I was like bowled over. So at any given point in time, 2/3 of our officially reported people that were missing in the state of Nebraska were kids, right? And in our state, it's 18 years or younger, right? So an 18-year-old is still a minor in the state of Nebraska. So most missing persons, native or non-native, were youth. The high concentrations of 13 to 17-year-olds, disproportionately male, and disproportionately Black and Native American. So I was like, holy smokes, right? Like, we need to know more about this. This was not the purpose of this original study, but I'm a social scientist. I got to follow the questions, right? I got to follow the data, what the data is telling me. And the data was telling me you need to look at kids. And I had a friend and colleague at the Nebraska Foster Care Review Office, which is the state agency that is responsible for independent oversight of all of our child welfare organizations, all kids that are in out-of-home care. So this includes our kids that are in out-of-home care that are juvenile justice involved, child welfare involved, and our crossover kids, which is really important because the data that Carolyn presented is just kids that are in out-of-home care placement because of child welfare. So this doesn't include our children that are in out-of-home care placement that are juvenile justice involved if they're not one of those crossover kiddos, right, where they're also child welfare involved. So what we did was, and because I have super limited time, I'm just going to cut to the chase. So basically what we found was at any given time, 30% of Nebraska's officially reported missing people, right? So this means they've been reported missing. They're on our state clearinghouse, they're in the NamUs data, or they're in the NCMEC data, right? So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So they've been officially reported missing. Any given time, 30% of our missing people are minors. Disproportionately Black and Native American kids are missing at any given time. This led me to go to our foster care review office, a colleague there, and ask her, if I give you a list of kids who were missing on this date, can you tell me, not the kids, but just tell me how many of these kids were in out-of-home care placement when they were missing? I'll give you the identified list. You just look at your rolls and tell me just how many, just give me a number. Because I wanted to know, is there anything there? She sends me an email. She's like, there's something there. You need to dig in. So I went through all the proper channels. We became a research partner for Foster Care Review Office. We did our IRB. We did all that jazz. So then we were able to actually get the data, right? And what we found was that in Nebraska, when we looked at our officially reported missing kids, and we matched that list to our kids that were in out-of-home care, that 3% of our kids in out-of-home care had been officially reported missing, right? Which you might remember Carolyn told you that in 2019, nationally, the national average was only 0.98, right? So that means that in Nebraska, it's about 3 times the national rate. So we were like, whoa, okay, for missingness in our out-of-home care. So I say that because it would be, crime is local, social problems are local, right? So national data is fantastic, but I really encourage you guys as a task force to find a research partner and look at the Colorado data. I'm sure you guys have plans to do that, but the national data will only tell you so much. You will find Colorado specific issues that you need to be digging into. It sounds like access to substance abuse treatment is going to be one of those things, and that is going to matter on the front end and the back end, right? So we found higher percentage, than the national estimates of missingness from out-of-home care in Nebraska. Again, disproportionate impact on Black and Native American children. Again, we found placement stability matters, right? So we looked at all the kids in out-of-home care placement and the kids that were missing from placement versus not missing from placement. Placement stability mattered, right? Having those kids bouncing around in and out of care, in and out of different placements, that increased their risk of missingness. We also found that relative placement provided a protection against missingness, right? So those kinship foster care placements were much less likely to have those kids go missing, right? We also found this sort of interesting nugget around permanency placements. And so 18% of our kids that were missing from out-of-home care were nearing permanency, right? And that we had a big report out with all of our stakeholders when we were done with this study, including DHHS, including juvenile probation. And we had this huge conversation about how and I'm saying the universal we. I just present the data, the experts, the practitioner experts decide what this means, right? So there was this really robust conversation about trying to do more around listening to the kiddos themselves about like, what are they telling you? Are they saying like, you can send me here, but I'm not going to stay? And then what do we do about that, right? And so this was something that really highlighted, you know, we think permanency placements, we, the outsiders, the researchers are like, this is great. This is the happy ending. And then come to find from the experts that no, sometimes like I don't, you know, as the youth, as the child, I want to stay with grandma. I don't care that the, you know, state thinks she's too old or she's not, doesn't have enough money or whatever. That's where I'm going to go. And that's where I'm going to stay. Right. I don't want to stay with this uncle or whatever. Right. So really this conversation around trying to do more around listening to youth and to children when they tell you where their preferred placement is, and then trying to do all that the system can to get that placement to be that child's placement, right? Even if it, you know, even if they are never going to be a certified placement. So again, I leave that to the practitioner experts to talk about, but as a social scientist, we always say no screening without service. Right. So if we're going to do risk assessments around missingness, if we're going to ask, you know, children and youth questions about these things, there's got to be some kind of service or intervention for them. So anyways, I open it for questions. You know, again, thanks for having us. We really just love talking about, you know, the action items that could potentially align with what we've been looking at in the data.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions, reactions, comments. And I do want to make sure, also, I was just going to say real quick, and sorry, if there's a member of the public that's hoping to do public comment at the end of today's meeting, we welcome that. If you could send me a note in the chat so that I just have a heads up as to how many folks we're expecting. But thanks, Dr. Richards and Carolyn. Wondering questions and reactions from task force members.
I'll say something. It's Janelle.
Hey, Janelle.
So I had my camera off for the last 45 minutes, but I've been listening to everything. And as much as I appreciate all the data and all the research and all of these things, none of that is going to change unless there is some more aggressive legislation that goes in, and maybe even changing some of the past legislation that has just recently been passed. Law enforcement doesn't have any rights when it comes to kids running away. DHS doesn't really have any rights. All of these problems are that the actual professionals and the authority figures in their life can't do what they need to do because a few small stories have changed legislation for the masses. And I see a lot of shaking heads. I'm not saying this to like bash anybody that supported Families First Act. I, per one, I will tell you personally and professionally, I did not support it, and I still don't. The downfall is catastrophic for children, in my opinion. And so I know that Stephanie and I had conversation a couple of weeks ago, and what I really would like to see is a list of protocols of what can and cannot be done for law enforcement, DHS, residential placements, foster care, kinship, all of those things, because running away isn't a crime, and police, they're not the runaway police, right? And so it's really hard. Most officers care, and if you call and do something, they will absolutely go do that welfare check, and if there's a pickup order or whatever, they'll take them in, but then they go to the jack and then they get released, and then we have QRTP, which takes months, and they're in there and they get re-victimized. I mean, it is a horrible, horrible cycle that they go through, and we're the ones getting yelled at. And so I guess I would just like to see where the gaps are, so something could be built to make something a statewide thing that trumps all. So when DHS is called at 1 o'clock in the morning at an undercover operation sting, and they're like, oh, well, you have a safety plan in place. We're not coming. No, get your butt out here. Or when we call law enforcement and law enforcement says, well, we've got, they run all the time. This is just what they do. Legislation says, no, you need to go check this. Or that there's some type of other residential facility that can be created that there is a locked door, but it's not jail. They can actually get that mental health stuff. And there's so many things blocking that right now. So all I hear from all of this data is all of these holes. And so it's, yeah, sorry, Barrett, go.
No, I'd love to jump in and just probe a little bit, because I think it's so easy for us to really just be looking at the entire system. And I think in your words, it raises an interesting question. When I pull us back to what we're charged with doing, which is really looking to reduce the incidence of runaways. And I think what you're kind of flagging is there's one side of it, which is intercepting runaways, stopping it from happening, whether that's closed doors or official action. There's the other side of it of reducing the inclination and the desire to do it in the first place. And so I would just be curious from your perspective, when I pull us up to look at what do we need to change at the system level to reduce the number of runaways? And yes, part of that is preventing it from happening by someone who's decided to do so. The other side of it is a system that disincentivizes that from happening in the first place. So I'm curious, in addition to this gap analysis that you suggest, what other type of information or data would be helpful to you in us looking at that question of how do we, at the most fundamental level, reduce this from happening? So it's not just who are we calling out, but we're changing.
Well, I'm calling out everyone for what it's worth, including myself, because there's only certain protocols I can even do. And I'm like, and parents are screaming at me, and I'm like, I can't tackle your 15-year-old to the ground as much as I want to. Sometimes I can't do it. And it's really frustrating. And when you say, what do you think it is to take to prevent it? And not looking at the whole, I do think it's a whole system problem, because I think there's holes in every piece and facet of it that creates it for a whole problem. And then we get task force that fixes one piece and we pass things, and then there's 57 other things blocking it. So it doesn't really matter. So it has to be a whole process look, right? We have to pick out different pieces. Coming to the prevention side, at least in my work, I can tell you right now, I've sat in DUIS situations, I've sat in the Jack and the Gill, all of those things. And they're like, well, I'm just going to leave. What are you going to do? They know there's not consequences, so they will continue to do what they want to do as well. And, I see Miss Montoya's head shaking because I know her story. And, so many things could have been prevented there.
And to be clear, I was not at all disagreeing.
We're setting the status, I think, when it comes to the prevention part, and kids know, like, kids are far from dumb, especially when it comes to kids that have been on the street and have been raised that way. They know more than we do in a lot of ways. And they know that they're not going to get in trouble. They know running away isn't a crime. They know that they can steal a car 87 times and go back to court in Denver and continue to be released to foster homes that aren't equipped to take them, or to residential facilities that they're able to run from. And they can do that 50 times before commitment is even suggested through the QRTP process. And so I do think it's a bigger thing. I get what we're charged with, but what we're charged with isn't going to make an effect or make sense if we don't look at it as a bigger picture, in my opinion.
I got you. No, thank you. And thank you for coming off camera, and understand I was not in any way challenging or disagreeing. I just want to keep pushing us to identify where do we need to expand our thinking, drilling on this issue of how do we reduce. And Trace, I'll hand it back to you, and I see Ms. Montoya.
Oh, you don't offend me. Don't worry, Barrick. It's fine. You're good. You got to do better than that.
I was gonna say Janelle can handle it. I have a feeling. Thanks, Barrick and Janelle. Elizabeth, I'm gonna have you come off, and then we do have a couple folks with public comment, so I want to make sure we reserve time for that. So Elizabeth, go ahead, and then also want to make sure we thank Dr. Richards and Carolyn before y'all need to jump off as well.
Yes, thank you, ladies, for your studies and your data that you presented today. I'm just tagging on what Janelle said, as far as looking at all different aspects. I think that kids running, as long as they know there's not a consequence, they're going to continue to do it. And in other states, as far as I know, Utah is the only state that allows locked doors in their residential facilities, but that's from a report from a family from several years ago. Also in Texas, there's at least one facility, and I believe probably most of them, that will tackle your kid if they try to leave the property. So there are other states with other options, and I plan to try to make some calls and look into that further. But anyway, good point, Janelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Dr. Richards and Carolyn, thank you so much. I certainly hope this is not our last time in conversation with you. I don't think it will be. So just a quick little virtual round of applause for you all. And thank you for your time. And we will let you all hop off, and we'll get to our public comment. And then I want to give a few closing comments as well. And Stephanie, give you a chance as well to help wrap us up. But I'm seeing 2 public comments, and I'm going to start in the order that I received them. So Andrew, if you could come off mute and introduce yourself, let us know who you are, and then if you could limit your comments to 3 minutes, that'd be appreciated. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Gabor. I'm with the Colorado Behavioral Health Administration. This is my first time at this meeting, so I really do appreciate everyone's efforts on this issue. I have a few questions for the committee in terms of future agendas. I'm wondering if this committee will be looking at the psychological and physical trauma that occurs for children and youth when they are secluded or restrained, kind of going back to Dennis Asparos's comment earlier on. I used to work in residential, and like I have lasting scars, and I wasn't secluded or restrained. I just participated in them, both physically and emotionally. So wondering if that's going to be part of the agenda. I'm also wondering, and there's a lot of discussion earlier on about what happens when a youth does return to a facility or a foster family home. I'm wondering about, is there connection between the treatment teams, both at the facilities, at the community level, at the case management level or case worker level, around creating a better safety net? We know that children do not run because of a vacuum, okay, or in a vacuum. They run because they're triggered. They're running because they want to go somewhere safer, because they want to go somewhere that feels safer, even if it might not be safer. And so what's the safety planning that is specific to that child or youth's perspective, and the family's perspective, and the system's perspective on that youth, to ensure that the next running event can be prevented in the first place on an individual level? So yeah, those are my comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate your comments and appreciate you being here. I think I mentioned this in the chat to you, but because of the nature of this work, we're not going to do like a live interaction with public comment, but we'll certainly capture those and ensure that the task force can address that as they would like moving forward. So appreciate your questions and your comments. I'm going to move to Steve Fisher. Steve, if you could introduce yourself and limit your comments to 3 minutes if possible. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll just introduce myself briefly. Whatever my Zoom identifier says, my day job is a civil engineer, but I'm a board member of Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health Colorado chapter. And a reason I'm interested in this is because I live across the street from the Tennyson Center. Sorry for the phone call. Since 1995. So I've seen hundreds of runs and rescues. I'd like to go back and speak to Mr. Lash's, I'll call it astonishment, about the lack of viable methods to prevent a runaway. We heard from Dennis Desparos and Dave Lee. Obviously, restraining is not a viable tactic. And we heard from Lynette Obermeyer that seemed to conflate locked fences with what is labeled as locked up or a locked down facility. I read the statutes, and to me, there is nothing preventing a fence or the locking of a fence to keep kids safe. Note that the right fence can achieve a lot of safety for staff and children without restraint. Even some regular district elementary schools have more fencing than residential care facilities or facility schools. Going back to Mr. Lash's, I think, sentiment, And I'm asking about a sort of informed consent requirement, maybe it already exists, that parents and guardians need to be told very frankly by facility staff that the following: the facility has no means, such as effective fencing, to prevent outside persons access to children, and that the children must be allowed to walk or run away into the neighborhood and beyond. That their children may be followed hundreds of feet behind, but not touched. That pursuit and even following can lead to rash decisions, to unsafely cross busy streets, self-harm, or damage property. That staff may eventually lose contact with the child for hours or days. And that there is no requirement to inform the parent or guardian of runs or close calls, because those events don't meet the definition of the so-called critical incident. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate your comments and appreciate you being here and your engagement with this task force. All right, I'm going to, Stephanie, I want to give you a chance for any kind of final comments, and then I have a survey for folks as we leave today so that we can get some feedback as we look at our agendas moving forward and just how today's meeting landed. But Stephanie, just as chair, and also Beth as our new co-chair, any closing comments from the both of you?
Yeah, I just first of all want to thank our speakers. I want to thank everybody who helped us really present and put on this meeting today. I do, secondly, want to say for Andrew Gabor and also for Steve Fisher, I will personally follow up with you. I always feel like public comment feels a bit unsatisfactory, and I don't like that because I really appreciate what has been said by both of you today. And, I want to make sure that we include your thoughts, your expertise into the work of this task force. So I believe I know how to get a hold of both of you. And if not, if you could send Trace just your email and or cell phone, that'd be great, because I don't have chat access right now. And third, just if you could please fill out the survey. What is working well for you during these sessions? Is the information enough? Is it not enough? What additional information could be useful? As you do so, though, please take in mind the syllabus that is in the Dropbox, because it is the roadmap to show you, for example, that there will be a section on the law, as I articulated earlier, a variety of different areas of law. So just want to encourage you, we don't get better if we don't hear from you. And that's the goal, is to make sure we make this the best experience. So just in advance, thank you. And really, it's just an education and so informative. And I appreciate you all.
Thanks, Stephanie. I also, I'm just seeing in the chat, and I wanted to, we might have one more public comment. And so I just want to make sure, because there was an earlier request. Cindy, were you wanting to share any quick public comment before we close things out? Cindy?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to, say that I'm sorry for the circumstances that led to the need for this task force, particularly for Ms. Montoya. I'm really happy to see what everyone is doing. And I think that there are opportunities to do kind of the short, medium, and long-term work, kind of, at the more immediate levels in terms of like organizational policies and procedures, but also in terms of like state legislation, federal legislation. I just wanted to quickly just say that in terms of, Black children and children of color disproportionately running away from these kinds of situations, these are also the kind of children that are disproportionately placed in the situations to begin with. I also want to point out and remind people, those of us who are old enough to remember this, back in 1996, our social welfare system for the United States was basically destroyed or devolved, however you want to call it. So we're, a few decades into not really having a decent safety net for children and families. And children are often removed from homes due to housing instability, food insecurity, and that kind of thing, like things that could basically easily be addressed by providing families of origin with the services they need. The single parent families, families in poor communities, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll leave it at that, but I just want to say that I'm happy to be joining. This is my first call, and I have a bit of expertise to offer in terms of I'm a health and social science researcher at the national level. I live in Colorado, and I look forward to doing what I can to support all the great work you guys are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate your comments. And similar to what Stephanie said, Cindy shared her email. So Stephanie, I'll share that with you as well for any follow-up you'd like to do. Okay, well, as Stephanie said, I'll just reiterate, so appreciative of both the folks that presented today and also all of your engagement and participation. I'm going to drop in now a survey that really just has some broad questions for you to answer, and also opportunities for any additional feedback. Be as honest as you can. I also just realized I didn't put a spot for your name. So if you'd like for your name to be in there, just put it in the additional comments, but you're also welcome to leave that anonymous as well. So thank you for your time today. Our next meeting is March 1st. We certainly appreciate any conversations between now and then, and we will see you then. So thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.